Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world so dazzling, so impossibly luxurious that it makes today's billionaires look modest. Picture this. The year is 1883, and in a mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City, a woman is about to throw a party that costs $3 million. That is not a typo. $3 million in 1883, adjusted for inflation. We are talking about roughly $90 million today spent on a single night. But here is the twist that will keep you awake tonight. Many of these women draped in diamonds and worth gowns dancing in ballrooms that could fit 400 people would eventually lose everything. Their fortunes would crumble, their reputations would shatter, and some would discover that all that glitter was hiding something far more sinister than they ever imagined. This is the true story of how the most powerful women in America went from ballrooms to bankruptcy, and trust me, the fall was spectacular. Now, before we dive deeper into this gilded world, I need a tiny favor from you. If you're enjoying this journey back in time, would you mind hitting that like button? And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. It really helps me keep bringing you these stories. Also, I am curious, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. I love seeing where in the world you all are. And hey, maybe dim those lights, get comfortable, grab that pillow, and let us step back in time together. Ready? Let us go. Imagine walking down Fifth Avenue in New York City in the year 1885. The air smells different than it does today. There is the scent of horse manure. Yes, but also the perfume of money. New money, old money, railroad money, oil money, steel money, money that is building skyscrapers, laying railroad tracks across an entire continent, and most importantly, money that is desperate to prove itself. You see rows of limestone mansions, each one trying to outdo the next. These are not just homes, they are statements. They are declarations of war in a battle fought not with swords but with chandeliers, tapestries, and guest lists. And at the center of this glittering universe stands one woman, Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Not just Caroline Astor, mind you, the Mrs. Astor. The definite article was essential. There were other heirs, of course, but there was only one Mrs. Astor, and everyone knew exactly who that meant. Now, let me paint you a picture of this woman. Born in 1830, Caroline came from old Dutch money. Her family had been in New York since the 1600s. They were not the richest, but they had something that new millionaires could not buy: lineage, history, that intangible quality called breeding. She married William Backhouse Astor Jr., grandson of John Jacob Astor, who had made his fortune in fur trading and real estate. By the time Caroline took her place as the Mrs. Astor, the family fortune was estimated at around $87 million. In today's money, that is roughly $2.4 billion. But here is what made Caroline truly powerful. She understood that in a country without kings and queens, without an official aristocracy, someone had to decide who mattered and who did not, and she appointed herself to that role. Every Monday evening during the social season, Mrs. Astor would hold court in her mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue. That address, by the way, is now the site of the Empire State Building. Think about that for a moment, where tourists now take selfies and look out over Manhattan. There once stood a brownstone where the fate of social climbers was decided over champagne and oysters. Her ballroom could accommodate exactly 400 guests, not 399, not 4,001, exactly 400, and this number would become legendary. Enter Ward Mallister, a man who deserves his own dramatic entrance. Ward was Mrs. A's social secretary, confidant, and the person responsible for one of the most exclusive lists in American history. He was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1827, practiced law briefly, then decided that law was far too boring. Instead, he would dedicate his life to the much more important task of deciding who belonged in high society. Ward had a theory. He believed that in all of New York City, with its growing population of millions, there were only 400 people who truly mattered. Only 400 people who, as he put it, felt at ease in a ballroom. Now you might be thinking, what does that even mean, at ease in a ballroom? Let me explain. Imagine you are suddenly transported to a formal dinner at Buckingham Palace. You're surrounded by dukes and duchesses. There are 7 forks at your place setting. Servants are speaking French. Someone mentions their recent trip to their country house, which turns out to be a castle with 47 rooms. Would you feel at ease? That is what Ward meant. He was not just talking about wealth. Plenty of people had money. He was talking about a specific type of person who'd been raised from birth to navigate these social situations. People who instinctively knew which fork to use, how to address a count versus a baron, and most importantly, who understood the unspoken rules of old money society. On February 16, 1892, the New York Times published Ward's official list of the 400. The anticipation before that publication was intense. People had been speculating for years about who would make the cut. Dinner, party conversations revolved around it. Mothers coached their daughters. Fathers strategized about business connections. And when the list finally came out, drama, pure, delicious drama. The list included bankers, lawyers, brokers, real estate magnates, and railroad men. There was one editor, one publisher, one artist, and T.W.O. architects thrown in for good measure. It was a careful mix of what Ward called knobs and swells. Knobs were old money. Families like the Ayres, the Livingston, the Van Renellas. Their fortunes came from inheritances stretching back generations. Their names appeared in the history books. They could trace their lineage back to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam. Swells, on the other hand, were the nouveau riche. They had made their money recently, often through industry or railroads, and Mrs. Astor, though she hated to admit it, had to include some of them. Why? Because by the 1880s, these new millionaires had so much money that ignoring them was becoming impossible. But oh, how she made them work for it. Let me tell you about the parties, because these were not just parties. They were spectacles. They were theater. They were opportunities to display wealth in ways that would make even modern celebrities blush. Women wore gowns imported from Charles Frederick Worth in Paris, the most exclusive designer of the era. A single Worth gown could cost $10,000, which is about $350,000 today. And these women owned dozens of them. They would never be caught wearing the same dress twice to an important event. The jewels were even more outrageous. Mrs. Astor herself owned a diamond stomacher that was so heavy it had to be supported by special undergarments. Can you imagine? Your jewelry is so massive that you need structural support to wear it. And the parties themselves were legendary. There was the time Mrs. Astor held a ball where she required every guest to dress as a famous historical figure. The preparation took months. Costumes were commissioned from Europe. Jewelers worked overtime. One woman reportedly spent $50,000, about $1.7 million today, on her costume alone. Food was invested from around the world. Champagne flowed like water. Actually, champagne flowed more far easily than water. Because good drinking water was still a challenge in parts of New York City. Orchestras played. Flowers filled every available surface. The cost of these events could exceed $100,000, which is over $3.5 million in today's money. But here is what makes this whole thing fascinating and a little bit sad. Beneath all this opulence, there was a desperate insecurity. You see, the United States in the late 1800s was going through an identity crisis. The country had recently emerged from the Civil War. Immigration was exploding. The population of New York City was growing almost exponentially. In 1860, about 800,000 people lived in New York. By 1890, that number had more than doubled to over 1.5 million. People from all over the world were arriving at Ellis Island with dreams and ambitions. Some of them were getting rich, very rich, through hard work and innovation. And the old guard families, the ones who had been comfortable for generations, suddenly felt threatened. Mrs. Astera and her 400 were essentially building a wall, trying to hold back the tide of change. They created elaborate rules about who could visit whom, who could marry whom, what was acceptable behavior and what was not. It was a last-ditch attempt to maintain control in a rapidly changing world. Mark Twain, always perceptive, always a bit cynical, gave this era its name. He called it the Gilded Age, not the Golden Age. Gilded, covered with a thin layer of gold on the outside, but underneath something else entirely. Twain knew what he was talking about. He saw the corruption, the greed, the vast inequality, while Mrs. Astor was spending millions on parties. Immigrants were living in tenement buildings where entire families shared single rooms with no running water. While the 400 were deciding which fork to use for their oysters, children were working in factories for pennies a day. But, Tony, we are focusing on what happened to these women at the top, because here is the irony that would have shocked Mrs. Astor. Even at the pinnacle of society, even with millions in the bank, even with your name on the most exclusive list in America, you were not safe. The gilded surface was thinner than anyone realized, and underneath cracks were forming. Financial panics would sweep through the country, wiping out fortunes overnight. Husbands would die, leaving their wives to discover that the family money was gone. Daughters would be sold off to European aristocrats in loveless marriages that were really just business transactions, and the very rules that Mrs. Astor had worked so hard to establish would eventually trap the women who lived by them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in 1883, everything seems golden. The ballrooms are full, the champagne is flowing, the Worth gowns are rustling, and 400 names rule an empire built on railroad tracks and oil, wells and steel beams. Mrs. Astor stands at the top of her grand staircase, receiving her guests. She is wearing that famous diamond stomacher. Her hair is perfectly arranged. She nods graciously to each arrival, deciding with each nod whether they have truly arrived in society or whether they are still on probation. Ward Mallister hovers nearby, whispering the names of guests, providing crucial intelligence about who is in favor and who is not. The orchestra plays a Viennese waltz, couples spin across the polished floor, and if you could freeze time at that moment, if you could capture that single perfect evening when everything seemed secure and eternal, you would see something remarkable. You would see women who believed they had won, who believed their positions were secure, who believed that with enough money and the right connections they could control their destinies. They had no idea what was coming. Because while they danced, forces were already in motion that would change everything. New families with new money were plotting their invasions of society. Financial systems were becoming increasingly unstable. And most dangerous of all, the daughters of these women, raised in luxury, educated to be ornaments, were about to discover that they were pawns in a game where the stakes were impossibly high. One of those daughters was a girl named Consuelo Vanderbilt. Remember that name? Her story is one of the most heartbreaking of this entire era. But before we get to Consuelo, we need to understand the family she came from. We need to understand why the Vanderbilts were both the most envied and the most despised family in New York. We need to understand the woman who would stop at nothing, absolutely nothing, to get her family accepted into Mrs. Ayres's 400. That woman was Alva Vanderbilt, and she was about to change the rules of the game forever. But Alva's story is not just about ambition. It is about desperation. It is about what happens when you grow up with money, then lose it all, then claw your way back to the top. It is about the things we are willing to sacrifice, the lines we are willing to cross when we want something badly enough. And as we will discover in our next chapter, Alva Vanderbilt would cross every line. She would break every rule, and in the processor, she would set in motion events that would lead to one of the most famous forced marriages in American history. A divorce that scandalized 2 continents and a transformation that nobody saw coming. So stay with me, because this story is just beginning. We have talked about the glittering surface, but now We're going to dig deeper. We are going to explore what happened when old money met new money in a collision that was as spectacular as it was inevitable. We are going to witness the battle that will determine the future of American high society. And we are going to discover that sometimes winning can cost you everything. The ballroom doors are closing on this evening. The last waltz is ending. But outside those doors, a storm is brewing, and the woman at the center of that storm is someone Mrs. Astor has been trying desperately to keep out of her sacred 400. But Alva Vanderbilt is not the type of woman who takes no for an answer. And the weapon she is about to use, a party so spectacular, so over the top, so undeniably magnificent that even Mrs. Astor herself will have to pay attention. That confrontation between old money and new money, between established society and ambitious outsiders, between the world that was and the world that was coming, that is where we are heading next, and trust me, you do not want to miss it. So let me tell you about a war, not the kind fought with guns or soldiers, but something far more brutal in its own way. This was a war fought with invitations, with seating arrangements, with who acknowledged whom at the opera. And at the center of this war were two types of families that absolutely despised each other, old money and new money. Now you might be thinking, money is money, right? What difference does it make where it came from? But oh, in the Gilded Age, the difference was everything. It was the difference between being accepted and being shunned, between your daughter marrying well and becoming a social pariah, between being invited to Mrs. A's Monday evening gatherings and spending your millions in lonely isolation. Let us start with old money because they were the ones making the rules. Old money families in New York trace their wealth back generations, sometimes centuries. The Livingstons, for example, had been granted vast land holdings by the British Crown in the 17th century. The Van Renelers owned land that stretched as far as the eye could see along the Hudson River. The Scherer, Horns, Mrs. A's family, had made their fortune in shipping back when New York was still a small port town. These families had something that could not be bought: time. Their grandfathers knew each other's grandfathers. They had attended the same schools for generations. They summered in the same places, worshipped at the same churches, were buried in the same cemeteries. Their money was so old that people had forgotten where it originally came from, which was somehow seen as more dignified. And here is the key thing about old money. They did not talk about money ever. It was considered vulgar. You might own half of Manhattan, but you would never mention it at dinner. Your townhouse might contain treasures worth millions, but you would refer to it modestly as the house in town. This understated approach, this careful avoidance of appearing too eager or too flashy, this was the hallmark of old money breeding. Mrs. Astor embodied this perfectly. Yes, she threw lavish parties, but she did so with a certain restraint. Well, as much restraint as you can have while wearing $500,000 worth of diamonds. But you get the idea. There was a proper way to display wealth and an improper way, and old money knew the difference. Then came the railroad barons, the oil tycoons, the steel magnates, the new money families who were making fortunes that dwarfed anything old money had ever seen. The Vanderbilts were the perfect example. And oh, how Mrs. Astor detested them. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, started with nothing. He was born in 1794 on Staten Island to a family of farmers. His father ran a small ferry business. Young Cornelius quit school at age 11 to work on the ferries. 11 years old, can you imagine? But this man had something that all the old money breeding in the world could not match. He had vision, ruthlessness, and an incredible talent for making money. He started with one small ferry boat, then another, then steamship, then railroads. By the time he died in 1877, he was worth over $100 million. In today's money, that is approximately $2.7 billion. He left most of that fortune to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who somehow managed to double it. William Henry once famously said, "The public be damned. I am working for my stockholders." This quote perfectly captures the Vanderbilt approach: direct, aggressive, unapologetic, and this is exactly what made old money uncomfortable. The Vanderbilts were too obvious, too bold, too successful management. They had clawed it out of the earth and the rails and the steam engines. Their money smelled of cold smoke and machine oil. It was new and, therefore, according to old money standards, it was tainted. Mrs. Astor had a particularly telling phrase about the Bilts. She said their money was distasteful, not that they were poor, not that they lacked wealth. The money itself was distasteful because it came from railroads, from industry, from trade, from actually working, if you can believe the nerve of them. Now, here is where our story gets interesting. Because in 1875, William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore, married a young woman named Alva Erskine Smith. And Alva was about to change everything. Let me take you back to Alice's childhood, because understanding where she came from explained so much about what she would become. Alva was born in 1853 in Mobile, Alabama. Her family was well-off Southern gentry, the kind of people who summered in fashionable places and associated with other respectable families. Young Alva spent time in Newport, Rhode Island, where she befriended other girls from prominent families. She traveled to Europe. She learned French. She developed expensive tastes. And then in 187, when Alva was just 17 years old, everything collapsed. Her mother died. The family fortune, which had never been as secure as it appeared, suddenly evaporated. There were bad investments, debts that came due, the kinds of financial disasters that wealthy families tried to hide but could not always avoid. Almost overnight, Alva went from being a young woman with every advantage to someone facing a terrifying future. She was not just mourning her mother. She was staring at the very real possibility of poverty, and for someone who had been raised with expectations of a certain lifestyle, this must have been absolutely devastating. Now, I want you to picture Alva at this moment in her life. 18 years old, recently motherless, watching her family's social standing crumble along with their bank account. She later described herself during this period as nearly peniles, nearly. That word is important. She was not quite without resources, but close enough that she could see the edge of the cliff. But Alva had something that many of her wealthier peers lacked. She had learned to fight. She had learned that nothing in life was guaranteed, and she had developed a ruthless clarity about what she needed to do to survive. Here is another detail that shaped Alva's story. She was not conventionally beautiful. In an era when a woman's appearance was considered her most valuable asset, this was a serious handicap. Contemporary descriptions of young Alva are telling. One acquaintance described her as having a square chin and a homely face. Another called her plain. Think about what this meant. In Gilded Age society, a beautiful face could open doors that money alone could not. A lovely daughter might marry into an even wealthier family. Beauty was currency, and Alva knew she could not rely on that particular currency. So, she cultivated something else. She became the most intelligent, most witty, most charming woman in any room she entered. She read voraciously. She could discuss art, literature, politics. She learned how to make powerful men feel clever and important. She developed what we might today call emotional intelligence, though back then they just called it being shrewd. And she kept wealthy friends, particularly a young woman named Consuelo Isnaga. Remember this friendship because Consuelo Isnaga would later marry into British aristocracy, and she would provide Alva with a roadmap for social climbing that Alva would follow with devastating effectiveness through Consuelo's Naga. Alva was introduced to William Kissam Vanderbilt, known as Willie. He was the grandson of the Commodore son of William Henry Vanderbilt, and he was fabulously wealthy. He was also somewhat aimless, the the kind of rich young man who spent his time racing yachts and collecting expensive toys. Alva saw her opportunity and seized it with both hands. She deployed every weapon in her arsenal. She was vivacious where other young women were merely pretty. She was interesting where they were boring. She challenged Willie intellectually where others simply agreed with everything he said. Within months, Willie was smitten. They married in 1875 when Alva was 22 and Willie was 26. Suddenly, the girl who'd been nearly penniless just 4 years earlier was now a Vanderbilt. She had access to a fortune that most people could not even comprehend. She had mansions, servants, unlimited, credit at the finest stores in America and Europe. But there was one thing she did not have: social acceptance. Oh, people took her money readily enough. Merchants were happy to sell her jewels and gowns. Architects were delighted to design her houses. But the doors of the 400 remained closed. Mrs. Astor made it clear through subtle signals and deliberate snubs that the Vanderbilts, no matter how much money they had, were not welcome in her inner circle. And this, I think, is where Alva's earlier trauma came into play. She had been wealthy, lost everything, and clawed her way back. She was not going to let anyone, not even the formidable Mrs. Astor, tell her where she could or could not go. Have you ever wanted something so badly that you could not think about anything else, that you lay awake at night planning, strategizing, imagining every possible move and countermove? That was Alva with social acceptance. It became her obsession. She studied the rules of old money society the way a general studies battlefield tactics. She learned exactly what offended them and what impressed them. She discovered that while old money pretended to be modest, they were actually just as status conscious as everyone else. They just expressed it differently. And then Alva had a revelation. She could not outtold the old money. She could never trace her lineage back to the 1600s, but she could overwhelm them with sheer magnificence. She could throw parties so spectacular, build houses so grand, and display wealth so ostentatiously that ignoring her would become impossible. In 1878, just 3 years after her marriage, Alva convinced Willie to commission a mansion on Fifth Avenue. Not just any mansion. She wanted something that would make every other house on the street look modest by comparison. She hired Richard Morris Hunt, the first American architect to study at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Together they designed what became known as the Petit Château. It was modeled after a French Renaissance castle. It had 60 rooms. The interior featured carved limestone, gilded woodwork, rare tapestries, stained glass imported from Europe, Renaissance, mantels and paintings by old masters. The house took 2 years to build and cost $3 million. In today's money, that is roughly $95 million. For a single house, in an era when most Americans earn less than $500 a year. But the house was just the beginning of Alva's master plan. The real weapon was going to be the housewarming party. Now, I need you to understand something about timing. In 1883, when Alice's house was finally complete, the Vanderbilts had been trying to break into Mrs. A's 400 for years. They had been rebuffed, snubbed, and ignored. Mrs. Astor had made it abundantly clear that railroad money was beneath her notice. Alva decided she was done asking for permission. She was going to force Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her, and the way she did it was absolutely brilliant in its cunning. Alva announced that she would be hosting a costume ball to celebrate the opening of her new house. Not just any costume ball. This would be the most elaborate, most expensive, most talked-about party in New York history. The theme was fancy dress, which meant guests had to come in elaborate historical or fantastical costumes. The party was scheduled for March 26, 1883. And here is where Alva's genius really showed. She made sure that everyone in New York society knew about this party months in advance. She let details leak strategically. The costumes people were planning, the decoration she was arranging, the entertainment she was hiring. New York society was abuzz with excitement. Young people especially were desperate to attend. They spent months planning their costumes, Seamstresses were working overtime. Jewelers were commissioned to create special pieces. One woman ordered a costume decorated with real silver embroidery. Another planned to come as a peacock with real peacock feathers. But here is the crucial detail. Alva had not invited Mrs. A's daughter, Carrie Astor. Now, Carrie Astor was a young woman in her early 20s, and she was very much part of the younger social set. All of her friends were planning the IR costumes and talking about the ball. There was even going to be a special quadrille, a choreographed dance that many young society people were rehearsing for. Carrie wanted to participate in this quadrille desperately. She was rehearsing with her friends, but as the weeks went by and no invitation arrived for the Astor household, Carrie became increasingly distressed. Finally, just days before the ball, Carrie reportedly went to her mother and explained the situation. All of her friends were going to be at this party. She'd been rehearsing for weeks. She would be humiliated if she could not attend. And Mrs. Astor faced a choice. She could maintain her principles and refuse to acknowledge Alva Vanderbilt, which would mean disappointing her daughter, or she could bend just this once and make a formal social call on Alva Vanderbilt. According to social rules of the time, Alva could not invite Mrs. Astor to her party unless Mrs. Astor had first called upon Alva. This was the protocol. Old money could ignore new money indefinitely simply by never making that first call, and Alva had used this rule against Mrs. Astor brilliantly. Mrs. Astor blinked first. She ordered her carriage, dressed in her calling clothes, and made the journey to Alva's new mansion. She was received in the drawing room where the two women exchanged the bare minimum of pleasantries required by etiquette. The visit lasted exactly 15 minutes, the minimum acceptable for a formal call, but it was done. Mrs. Astor had called upon Alva Vanderbilt, which meant that Alva could now, within the bounds of social propriety, invite the heirs to her party. The invitation was delivered the same day, and with that, Alva Vanderbilt had won. She had forced the Queen of New York society to acknowledge her. The party itself exceeded even the wildest expectations. 1,200 guests attended. 1,200. The house was decorated with orchids, roses, and palms imported from across the country. Champagne flowed from what seemed like an endless supply. The costumes were breathtaking. One guest came dressed as a Venetian Renaissance princess dripping with pearls that had belonged to Catherine the Great. Another dressed as a medieval knight in real armor. A third came as Marie Antoinette with a costume that cost today's equivalent of about $75,000. Alva herself appeared dressed as a Venetian princess wearing those famous pearls from Catherine the Great wrapped around her waist. The pearls alone were valued at $200,000, which is over $6 million today. The party lasted until daybreak. There was a full orchestra. There were professional performers. The dinner buffet featured delicacies from around the world. Contemporary accounts describe the evening as the most magnificent private entertainment ever given in America, and Mrs. Astor attended. She came with her daughter, and her presence at the party was noted by every newspaper in New York. The impenetrable wall had been breached. The Vanderbilts had arrived. But you know what is fascinating about this story? The cost. Alva spent the equivalent of roughly $90 million on her house and another estimated $6 million on the party. In total, nearly $100 million in today's money. That is what it cost to buy social acceptance. And even then, it was not really acceptance. It was more like a truce. Old money never fully embraced the Vanderbilts. They tolerated them. They attended their parties. But there was always a subtle undercurrent of disapproval. And here is what makes this relevant to our larger story. Alva had won the battle, but she was about to discover that victories in the Gilded Age came with unexpected prices. Because now that she had established herself as a power in New York society, now that she had proven that determination and money could overcome any obstacle, she was going to apply those same ruthless tactics to her daughter's future. And That daughter, Consuelo, was going to pay a price that no amount of money could ever repay. But before we get to that heartbreaking story, we need to understand one more crucial piece of the puzzle. We need to understand what Alva was really after, because social acceptance was just the beginning. Alva wanted something more, something that American money alone could never buy. She wanted a title. She wanted her family connected to European aristocracy. She wanted, in short, for her daughter to become a duchess. And the length she would go to achieve that goal, the pain she would inflict, the manipulation she would deploy would make her triumph over Mrs. Astor look gentle by comparison. Because forcing someone to acknowledge you at a party is one thing. Forcing your own daughter into a loveless marriage to a man she does not love, a man who does not love her, all for the sake of a title, that is something else entirely. And unfortunately, Alva was about to prove that she was capable of exactly that level of ruthlessness. There is a particular kind of tragedy that unfolds when a parent who has suffered decides that their child must succeed where they failed. And that's exactly what happened to Alva Vanderbilt. She had clawed her way up from near poverty, fought her way into society through sheer force of will, and now she was going to make absolutely certain that her children, especially her daughter, would never experience the terror she had felt at 17, when her mother died and the money disappeared. But here is the dark irony. In trying to protect her daughter from insecurity, Alva would inflict a different kind of damage entirely, a damage that money could not heal, a wound that would take decades to recover from. Let us talk about what it was like to be Alva's daughter. Cons. Well, Vanderbilt was born on March 2nd, 1877, 2 years after her parents' marriage. She was named after Alva's dear friend Consul Isniga, the one who had introduced Alva to Willie Vanderbilt. That friendship, that connection to someone who had successfully married into European aristocracy would cast a long shadow over young Consul's life. From the very beginning, Consul was not raised to be happy. She was raised to be perfect. Imagine being a little girl in the Vanderbilt household. You wake up in a bedroom larger than most people's entire homes. Servants attend to your every need. Your clothes are made by the finest dressmakers in Paris. You should be living a fairy tale, right? But here is what your actual day looks like. You are strapped into a device. It is a steel rod that runs down your spine, fastened around your waist and across your shoulders. You wear this for hours every day. Why? To improve your posture. Because a duchess must have perfect posture. You cannot slump, you cannot slouch, you must sit ramrod straight at all times. Consul later wrote in her autobiography about this torture device. She described how painful it was, how it bit into her skin, how she would count the minutes until she was allowed to remove it. She was a child and she was being treated like a piece of sculpture that needed to be molded into the correct shape. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional control. Alva decided everything, and I mean everything. What Consuelo wore, what she ate, where she went, who she could talk to, what she could read. There was no negotiation, no discussion. When young Consul once objected to a dress her mother had selected for her, Alva's response was chilling. I decide and you do as you're told. Not let us discuss this or tell me what you prefer, just cold, absolute authority, and if Consuelo stepped out of line, punish me. NT was swift and physical. Alva beat her daughter with a cane for even minor infractions. Think about that for a moment. This was not discipline. This was domination. This was a woman who had survived by the learning to control everything around her. And now she was applying those same control tactics to her own child. But why was Alva so harsh? Why could she not just let her daughter be happy? I think the answer lies in Ala's own trauma. Remember, she had been raised with every advantage only to watch it all disappear. She had felt the terror of potential poverty. She had experienced what it was like to go from someone to nearly no one, almost overnight. And she was absolutely determined that Consuelo would never ever be vulnerable in that way. In Alva's mind, She was not being cruel. She was being protective. She was preparing Consul for a world that was harsh and unforgiving. She was making sure her daughter would have the discipline, the bearing, the absolute perfection necessary to secure the ultimate prize, marriage into European aristocracy, because that was always the plan. From the moment Canuel was born, Alva knew what her daughter's destiny would be. Consul was going to marry a duke or a count or a prince. She was going to give the Vanderbilt family something that all their railroad millions could never buy: a noble title, a connection to centuries-old bloodlines, a bridge between American money and European prestige. Now, you might be wondering, why did American AEs need to marry European aristocrats? Why could they not just marry nice American boys and be happy? Well, let me tell you about a phenomenon that historians call the dollar princesses. In the late 1800s, something fascinating was happening on both sides of the Atlantic. In America, industrialization had created enormous new fortunes. Men like the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers had wealth that exceeded anything America had seen before. But they lacked one thing: pedigree, social status, the kind of respect that comes with centuries of history. Meanwhile, in Europe, particularly in England, the old aristocratic families were running out of money. The great estates that had supported these families for generations were becoming impossible to maintain. Agricultural depression meant that land, which had always been the source of aristocratic wealth, was no longer profitable. Death taxes were eating away at inheritances, and these families owned castles and manor houses that cost fortunes to heat, staff, and maintain. Many British aristocrats were, to put it bluntly, broke. Oh, they still had their titles. They still had their estates, but the actual cash to maintain their lifestyle that was disappearing fast. So a kind of transatlantic market emerged. American families wanted titles. British aristocrats needed money. And the daughters of American millionaires became the currency of exchange. Between 1870 and 1914, approximately 250 American heiresses married into British and European aristocracy. They brought with them an estimated $220 million in dowies. In today's money, that is roughly $6 billion. $6 billion flowed from American bank accounts into European estates during this period. These young women were literally buying titles with their families' fortunes, and they were called, sometimes admiringly but often mockingly, dollar princesses. Some of these marriages worked out. Jenny Jerome, who married Lord Randolph Churchill and became the mother of Winston Churchill, seemed to have a reasonably happy marriage, at least at first. Consul is Alva's friend, managed to navigate her marriage to an English viscount successfully enough. But many of these marriages were disasters. The young women were essentially sold to men they barely knew, often men who were significantly older, sometimes men who were cruel or unfaithful or both. The culture shock of moving from New York to an English country estate was enormous. The isolation was crushing, and the aristocratic families they married into often treated them with barely concealed contempt, seeing them as nothing more than walking bank accounts. But Alva did not care about any of that. Or maybe she did care, but she believed the trade-off was worth it. Security in Alva's worldview was more important than happiness. A title was forever. Love was temporary and unreliable, and so she began grooming Consul from childhood for this destiny. Consul was taught perfect. She was educated in art, music, literature, and history. She learned the complex etiquette of European courts. She was taken to Europe regularly to become familiar with the culture she would eventually join. Every aspect of her education was designed with one goal: to make her the perfect aristocratic wife. But here is the thing about Consuelo. Despite her mother's rigid control, despite the steel rod and the beatings and the constant supervision, she grew into a young woman with her own dreams and desires. And those desires did not include marrying a European aristocrat she had never met. Consuelo wanted something revolutionary. She wanted to marry for love. By the time Consul was 17, she had blossomed into a stunning young woman. contemporary descriptions of her are remarkably consistent. She had what people called a piquante ovale, face perched upon a long, slender neck. One writer described her enormous dark, eyes fringed with curling lashes. Another was captivated by her dimples and her tiny teeth when she smiled. She was by all accounts breathtakingly beautiful, and more than that, she was kind. Despite her mother's harshness, or perhaps because of it, Consuelo developed a genuine compassion for others. She was interested in charity, work. She cared about people who were suffering. She had a gentle soul that her mother's control had not managed to harden. And then in 1894, 17-year-old Consuelo met someone. His name was Winthrop Rutherford, and he was everything a romantic young woman could dream of. Winthrop was tall, athletic, charming. He was from a good American family, wealthy enough to be acceptable in society. He was kind to Consuelo, treated her with respect, made her laugh, and most importantly, he seemed to genuinely love her for who she was, not for what she represented or how much money she would bring to a marriage. They met at social events, always under careful supervision, as was proper for the time. But somehow, despite the chaperones and the watchful eyes, they fell in love. Real love. The kind that made Consuelo feel like maybe, just maybe, her life could be different than what her mother had planned. Consuelo later wrote that Winthrop seemed to embody all I admired in a man: high praise from someone who had spent her life surrounded by some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America. They began to talk about marriage, not just vague romantic dreams, but actual plans. Winthrop wanted to propose. Consuelo wanted to say yes. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like Consuelo might actually get to choose her own future. And then Alva found out. Now I need you to understand something about Alva. At this point in her life, she had fought for years to establish the Vanderbilt family in society. She had thrown the legendary party. She had built Marble House, another spectacular mansion in Newport that cost $11 million, which is over $350 million today. She had positioned herself as one of the great hostesses of the era, but she wanted more. She wanted immortality. She wanted the Vanderbilt name connected to European aristocracy forever, and her daughter, Mary. Some American boy, no matter how nice or how wealthy, was not going to accomplish that goal. So when Alva discovered that Consuelo was in love with Winthrop Rutherford, her reaction was nuclear. First, she tried reason. She explained to Consuelo why this match was unsuitable. Winthrop was an American. He had no title. Marrying him would be a waste of everything Consuelo had been prepared for. Did Consuelo not understand what Alva had sacrificed to position her for a better match? Consuelo, for perhaps the first time in her life, stood her ground. She loved Winthrop. She wanted to marry him. She did not care about European titles. Alva's response escalated. She forbade Consuelo from seeing Winthrop. She had servants watch Consuelo's every move. She intercepted any letters that might pass between the young lovers. She made it clear that if Consuelo pursued this relationship, there would be severe consequences. But Consuelo, emboldened by love, still resisted. She and Winthrop made plans to elope. They were going to run away together, get married, and present Alva with a fat comply. And this is where Alva revealed just how far she was willing to go. When Alva discovered the elopement plan, she did not just forbid it. She locked Consuelo in her room, literally locked her in. Consuelo was 18 years old, and she was a prisoner in her own home. Marble House, that beautiful mansion in Newport, became a gilded cage. But Alva was not done. She told Consuelo that if she tried to contact Winthrop, if she tried to run away, Alva would have him all killed. Not a vague threat, an explicit promise. "I will have him murdered," Alva reportedly said. Whether she actually would have followed through, we will never know. But Consuelo believed her mother was capable of it. Can you imagine your own mother threatening to kill the man you love? But even this was not enough to break Consuelo's resolve. She still refused to give up on Winthrop. So Alva deployed her final, most devastating weapon. She staged a medical emergency. One morning, Consuelo was told that her mother had collapsed, that she had suffered a heart attack brought on by the stress of Consuelo's disobedience, that the doctor had examined her and said her heart was weak, that any more emotional strain could be fatal. Consuelo, already isolated and frightened, was then visited by her mother's close friend, a woman named Lucy J., who was staying at Marble House. Lucy told Consuelo in grave tones that Alva's health was seriously compromised, that continued stress could kill her, that if Consuelo loved her mother at all, she would stop this foolishness about Winthrop Rutherford. And here is the cruel brilliance of Alva's manipulation. She knew her daughter. She knew that, despite everything, despite the steel rod and the beatings and the control, Consuelo was fundamentally kind. Consuelo could not bear the thought of causing her mother's death. Years later, in 1925, the truth would come out. Consuelo, seeking an annulment of her eventual marriage, would need to prove it had been coerced. Alva, incredibly, testified about what she had done. She admitted to Lucy J. and others that she had faked the heart attack, that she had manipulated her daughter through an elaborate performance designed to break her will. But in 1895, 18-year-old Consuelo did not know it was fake. She believed her mother was dying. She believed that pursuing her love for Winthrop would kill Alva. And so finally, she broke. Consuelo agreed to give up Winthrop Rutherford. She agreed to do whatever her mother wanted. She surrendered completely. And what did Alva want? She wanted Consuelo to marry a duke, not just any duke. The 9th Duke of Marlborough, a young Englishman named Charles Spencer, Churchill, who happened to be a cousin of Winston Churchill. On paper, it was a perfect match. The Duke owned Blenheim Palace, one of the most magnificent estates in England. He had a title that went back centuries. He represented everything that old money in Europe could offer. There was just one small problem. The Duke was broke. Blenheim Palace was falling apart. The roof leaked. The estate was hemorrhaged, edging money. The agricultural depression had decimated the income from the land. The 9th Duke needed an enormous infusion of cash just to keep his ancestral home from crumbling into ruins. And Consuelo Vanderbilt had that cash, or rather her father did. The marriage negotiations read more like a business merger than a romantic engagement. The Duke's representatives met with William Kissam Vanderbilt to hammer out the financial details. The settlement they reached was staggering. $2.5 million in railroad stock, which is about $90 to $1.6 million today, plus an annual income of $100,000 for both Consuelo and the Duke for as long as William Kissam lived, and there were other expenses William would spend. Another $2.5 million building Sunderland House, a magnificent London townhouse, for his daughter. All told, getting Consuelo married to the Duke would cost the Vanderbilt family somewhere between $15 and $20 million in today's money. The Duke, for his part, did not pretend this was about love. He was in love with someone else, a woman back in England, but he needed money more than he needed love. So he agreed to the arrangement, and Consuelo had no choice at all. The wedding was set for November 6th, 1895 at St. Thomas Church in Manhattan. It was going to be the social event of the decade, but as the date approached, something was very clearly wrong. Anyone paying attention could see that this was not a happy bride preparing for her wedding day. This was a young woman walking to her execution, and the most heartbreaking detail on the wedding day itself, as Consuelo stood at the altar in her beautiful Worth gown in front of hundreds of society's most prominent people, with flowers everywhere and an orchestra playing. She was crying, not tears of joy, tears of grief. She stood there weeping behind a veil as she married a man she did not love, giving up forever the man she did love, sacrificing her own happiness on the altar of her mother's ambition, and perhaps the cruelest irony of all. In just a few months, Alva herself would get divorced from William Kissam Vanderbilt, scandalizing society but freeing herself from an unhappy marriage. Alva would take her freedom while denying her daughter the same choice. But that's a story for later. Right now, in November of 1895, Canuello is boarding a ship to England, headed for a new life at Blenheim Palace, about to discover that having a title and living in a castle does not guarantee happiness any more than having millions of dollars does. What Consul did not know as she sailed across the Atlantic in November of 1895 was that she was part of a much larger phenomenon. She was not the first American heirs to be sold to European aristocracy, and she certainly would not be the last. In fact, she was participating in what might be the most extraordinary marriage market in modern history, where daughters became commodities and titles became price tags. Let me take you back a bit, because understanding this trade, this exchange of dollars for dukes, helps explain why Alva was so determined and why so many other families followed the same path. The whole thing really accelerated after the Civil War. Before 1865, wealthy Americans did marry Europeans occasionally, but it was not common. Most wealthy Americans married other Americans. But then something dramatic happened. The Industrial Revolution hit the United States like a freight train. No pun intended, G. Then how many fortunes were made on actual freight trains? Suddenly, men who had started with nothing were making fortunes that dwarfed the wealth of European monarchs. Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, J.P. Morgan in banking, and of course the Vanderbilts in railroads. By 1880, there were more millionaires in New York City than in all of England. Think about that. A country that had existed for less than 100 years had more concentrated wealth than a nation with 1,000 years of history. But here is what these new American millionaires did not have: respect. At least not the kind of respect they craved. In Europe, aristocrats might be poor, but they had something money could not buy. They had lineage. They could trace their families back to the Crusades, to medieval knights, to advisors of kings. They had coats of arms and ancestral portraits and castles with names. And American millionaires, no matter how much money they made, could not manufacture that kind of history. The best they could do was marry into it. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the British aristocracy was facing a crisis. The old system that had sustained them for centuries was collapsing. Their wealth had always come from land, from the rents paid by tenant farmers who worked vast estates. But in the late 1800s, a perfect storm hit the agricultural economy. First, there was competition from abroad. American wheat, grown on enormous mechanized farms in the Midwest, was flooding the European market. It was cheaper and often better quality than British wheat. Second, there were a series of bad harvests in Britain. The weather turned against farmers. Crops failed. And third, there were changes in tax law. Death duties, what we might call estate taxes today, were increasing. Every time an aristocrat died and passed his estate to his heir, a chunk of that wealth went to the government. The result? By the 1880s, many of the great aristocratic families of Britain were, to put it bluntly, broke. Oh, they still owned magnificent estates. They still had their titles. They still sat in the House of Lords and attended royal functions. But maintaining a castle is expensive. Blenheim Palace, for example, employed over 300 servants. 300 just to keep the house running. The heating bills alone were astronomical. The roof needed constant repair. The grounds required an army of gardeners, and the income from the agricultural land that was supposed to pay for all this, that income was shrinking year by year. So British aristocrats started looking across the Atlantic with new interest. Those American series who might lack proper breeding and might have fathers who made their money in trade, heaven forbid, also had something very attractive. They had cash, lots of it, immediately available, not tied up in land or entailed estates, but actual liquid wealth that could be deployed to fix roofs and pay servants and maintain the lifestyle that aristocratic dignity demanded. And thus a market was born. American heirs needed titles. British aristocrats needed money. Matchmakers emerged to facilitate these arrangements, Ambitious mothers like Alva actively sought out titled Europeans, and over the course of about 40 years, hundreds of these transatlantic marriages took place. Let me give you some examples because Consuelo's story makes more sense when you understand how common this was. There was May Gullet, who married the 8th Duke of Roxor in 1893. Her dowry was estimated at around $10 million, which is roughly $320 million today. That money saved the Roxburgh estates from bankruptcy. There was Mary Leiter, daughter of a Chicago department store magnate. In 1895, the same year as Consuelo's wedding, Mary married George Caron, who would later become Viceroy of India. Her dowry helped fund Caron's political career and the lavish entertaining expected of a viceroy. And perhaps most famously, there was Jenny Jerome, who married Lord Randolph Churchill in 1874. Her father was a New York financier. Lord Randolph was a younger son of a duke, which meant he had the title and the connections, but not much money. Jenny's dowry was more modest, only $50,000, but it was enough. And their son, Winston Churchill, would go on to become one of the most important figures of the 20th century. But for every Jenny Jerome who seemed to find some happiness in her marriage, there were many more American brides who discovered that European aristocracy was not the fairy tale they had been sold. There was Helena Zimmerman, daughter of a Cincinnati railroad and oil magnate, who married the 9th Duke of Manchester in 1900. The Duke was an alcoholic and a gambler who burned through Helena's fortune. She spent decades trying to hold the family together while her husband squandered her money. There was Anna Gould, daughter of the notorious robber Baron Jay Gould, who married Count Bonny de Castellani of France in 1895. The Count spent her money so recklessly that even by Gilded Age standards, it was shocking. He once spent $40,000, over $1.3 million today, on a single party. Anna eventually divorced him and married his cousin, which created a scandal that entertained both continents. Historians estimate that between 1870 and the start of World War I in 1914, somewhere between 200 and 250 American women married titled Europeans. The total amount of American money that flowed into European estates during this period was at least $220 million. In today's money, that is approximately $6.8 billion. $6.8 billion in dowies, buying not just individual marriages, but effectively propping up the entire European aristocratic system during a period of economic transition. Some people at the May called it an invasion. American dollars were conquering where American arms could not. These young women were referred to sometimes affectionately but often derisively as dollar princesses. The term captured both the reality of the transaction and the disdain that many people both in America and Europe felt about the whole arrangement. Because here is the thing that makes these stories so poignant. These were real young women, teenagers, most of them 17, 18, 19 years old. They had dreams and hopes and feelings, and they were being traded like livestock, like property in a market that valued them solely for their father's bank accounts. Many of these young women went into these marriages with romantic notions. They had read novels about handsome European aristocrats. They imagined themselves living in castles, tending balls, being presented at court. The reality was often crushingly different. The culture shock was enormous. British country houses in the late 1800s were cold, bitterly cold. They were drafty and damp. Central heating was rare. You would get dressed in the morning and you could see your breath in your bedroom. The bathrooms, when they existed at all, were primitive by American standards. The food was often terrible. British aristocratic cuisine in this period was notoriously bland. Overcooked meat, boiled vegetables, heavy puddings. American aces used the more varied and lighter fare popular in New York, often found British food almost inedible. And the social conventions were baffling. There were rules about everything. What you wore to breakfast versus what you wore to tea versus what you wore to dinner. How you addressed different levels of aristocracy, when you could speak and when you had to remain silent. The British upper class had centuries of unwritten rules, and American women, no matter how carefully their mothers had prepared them, constantly found themselves making embarrassing mistakes. But the worst part was often the loneliness. These young women were suddenly living in a foreign country far from their families and friends. Their husbands were often distant or unfaithful or both. Their new, aristocratic relatives frequently treated them with condescension, viewing them as necessary evils, useful for their money but lacking in proper breeding. And there was another painful dynamic at play. Many of these American heirs discovered their husbands did not just want their money. Their husbands expected them to continue providing money. The initial dowry was just the beginning. When the roof needed repair or the debts piled up or a new scandal required expensive damage control, the husbands would pressure their American wives to get more money from their American families. Some fathers kept sending money, unable to bear the thought of their daughters suffering. Others, like William Kissam Vanderbilt, set up careful trusts to ensure their daughters had independent income that could not be completely controlled by their husbands. But either way, these young women found themselves trapped in the role of perpetual fundraiser, forever the conduit through which American dollars flowed to prop up European estates. Now you might be asking, why did the parents do this? Why did mothers like Alva force their daughters into these arrangements? The answer is complicated. For some, it was pure social ambition. Having a daughter who was a duchess or a countess reflected glory on the entire family. It was the ultimate status symbol. When Alva could say, "My daughter, the Duchess of Marlborough," it validated all her years of fighting for social acceptance. It proved once and for all that the Vanderbilts had arrived. For others, there was a genuine belief that they were doing the right thing for their daughters. In the worldview of people like Alva, security was paramount. Love was fleeting. Romance was unreliable, but a title was forever. A daughter who was a duchess would always have status, would always be taken care of, would never face the kind of financial insecurity that Alva herself had experienced. And there was another factor, control. These marriages kept daughters within a certain sphere. They prevented daughters from potentially marrying someone inappropriate, someone without status or with the wrong kind of money. By arranging these European marriages, mothers like Alva maintained control over their daughters' futures in a way that allowing a love match with an American would not permit. But I think there was also something darker at play. Many of these mothers had themselves made advantageous marriages. They had married for position, for security, for their family's sake. They had sacrificed their own romantic dreams or never been allowed to have romantic dreams in the first place. And having made that sacrifice, they could not bear the idea of their daughters choosing differently. If they had suffered through loveless marriages for the sake of status and security, then by God their daughters would too. It is a pattern we see repeated through history, is it not? The abused sometimes become abusers. The controlled sometimes become controllers. Not because they are inherently cruel, but because they cannot tolerate the idea that their own suffering might have been unnecessary. If their daughters could be happy without making the same sacrifices, what did that say about their own choices? Alva, who had fought so hard for everything she had, who had clawed her way up from near poverty, who had forced herself into society through sheer determination, could not allow Consuelo to simply be happy with a nice American boy. That would have invalidated everything Alva had done. It would have suggested that all that fighting, all that sacrifice, all that ruthless ambition had been for nothing. So, Consuelo had to be a duchess, and if she had to cry at her own wedding, well, that was a small price to pay for security and status. But here is what makes this entire system even more troubling. Many of these marriages were arranged when the girls were children. Mothers would identify potential European aristocrats when their daughters were 13 or 14. They would begin corresponding, making connections, laying groundwork. By the time the girl was 16 or 17, the marriage would be essentially decided, even if she did not know it yet. Consul later wrote that she realized, looking back, that her mother had been planning her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough for years before she even met him. Every trip to Europe, every introduction, every careful cultivation of certain connections had been part of a long-term strategy. Consul had thought she was simply traveling and meeting people. She did not realize she was being auditioned and marketed. And the Duke of Marlborough, he approached the whole thing as a business transaction, because that is exactly what it was. He needed money. Consuelo had money. The terms were negotiated. A contract was signed. The fact that Consul was a real person with feelings was largely irrelevant to the process. Years later, after the wedding, the Duke reportedly told Consul that he was in love with another woman, and that he despised anything that was not British. Imagine hearing that from your new husband. You've just married him, given up the man you loved, crossed an ocean, and he informs you essentially that he finds you and everything about you repugnant except for your bank account. This was the reality behind the fairy tale. This was what becoming a duchess actually meant for many of these young American women. And here is perhaps the most sobering statistic. A significant number of these transatlantic marriages ended in divorce or separation, which in that era was scandalous and socially devastating. Even among those that technically stayed together, many were marriages in name only, with the husband and wife leading essentially separate lives. The dollar princess phenomenon represents one of the most cynical marriage markets in modern Western history. It reduced young women to commodities. It treated human relationships as business transactions. And it damaged both sides of the equation. The American heiresses were trapped in loveless marriages. The European aristocrats, who could have married for love if they had not been so focused on saving their estates, were equally trapped. But you know what the truly sad part is? Even as this system was causing so much unhappiness, it continued for decades, because the forces that created it, the American craving for status and the European need for money, were so powerful that individual suffering did not stop the machine. As long as there were wealthy American fathers and broke European aristocrats, the trade continued, and the women, the dollar princesses, many of them found ways to cope. Some threw themselves into charity work, finding meaning in helping others since they could not find happiness in their marriages. Some had affairs discreetly, finding love where they could. Some became powerful in their own right, using their positions and connections to influence politics and society. And some, like Consuelo, eventually found the courage to leave, to divorce, to reclaim their lives, even at great social cost. But that is getting ahead of our story. Right now, in November of 1895, Consul has just arrived at Blenheim Palace. She is 18 years old. She is a duchess. She is one of the wealthiest women in the world, at least on paper. And she's about to discover that a palace with 187 rooms can be the loneliest place on earth. Picture yourself stepping out of a carriage in front of Blenheim Palace for the first time. The building in front of you is not just a house. It is not even just a mansion. It is a monument. 187 rooms spread across 7 acres of building. The main facade is 320 feet wide. There are towers and colonnades and elaborate sculptures. The entrance hall alone is 67 feet high, decorated with elaborate murals and topped with elaborate plasterwork. This is where Consuelo Vanderbilt arrived as a new bride in late 1895, and her first thought, according to what she later wrote, was not wonder, it was dread. Let me tell you what life was actually like for Consuelo as the Duchess of Marlborough, because the reality was so far from the fantasy that it is almost darkly comic. First, there was the physical discomfort of the place. Blenheim Palace was built in the early 1700s. designed by John Vanbrugh, as a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough after his military victories. It was meant to be impressive, not comfortable. And oh, was it impressive. It was also freezing cold. British country houses of this era were notorious for being unheated, or rather they had fireplaces, dozens of them. But fireplaces are spectacularly inefficient at heating large rooms with high ceilings. Consul, hoo-ha. Dee, grown up in homes with modern central heating, now found herself living in a palace where she could see her breath in the morning. She would get dressed in layers, putting on wool stockings and heavy undergarments just to stay marginally warm. The bathrooms were another shock. Blenheim did have some plumbing by the 1890s, but it was primitive. Hot water was not guaranteed. The facilities were often far from the bedrooms, requiring long walks down cold corridors in the middle of the night. Consul had grown up with modern American plumbing. Now, she was living in conditions that felt medieval, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional isolation. Within days of arriving at Blenheim, Consul was introduced to her new mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess, and the Dowager Duchess wasted no time in making Consuelo's position clear. The Dowager Duchess reportedly told Consuelo, and I'm quoting from Consuelo's later autobiography here, "Your first duty is to have a child, and it must be a son, because it would be intolerable to have that little upstart Winston become Duke. Let that sink in for a moment. Your new mother-in-law's first words to you are not welcome to the family, or I hope you will be happy here. They are essentially, get pregnant immediately and make sure it is a boy, because otherwise someone we do not like will inherit." Winston Churchill, by the way, was the Duke's cousin, son of Lord Randolph Churchill, and that dollar princess we mentioned earlier, Jenny Jerome. Winston was next in line to inherit the dukedom if the 9th Duke died without male heirs. And the Dowager Duchess found this prospect intolerable, partly because she disliked Winston's branch of the family, but mostly because Winston's mother was American. The idea of an American woman's son inheriting Blenheim was to the Dowager Duchess an abomination. So Consuelo's value, her entire purpose, was immediately reduced to a single function. Produce a male heir, not be happy, not find fulfillment, not even be a good duchess, just get pregnant and have a son. And here is the truly sad irony. Consuelo did produce heirs. She had 2 sons, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, who would become the 10th Duke of Marlborough, was born in 1897. Lord Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill was born in 1898. She fulfilled her duty admirably and quickly, but fulfilling her duty did not make her happy. It did not make her husband love her, and it certainly did not make her life at Blenheim any easier. Let me tell you about the Duke, her husband, because understanding him is crucial to understanding Consuelo's unhappiness. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, was known as Sonny. Not because he had a sunny disposition, mind you, quite the opposite. The nickname came from his courtesy title before he became Duke, Earl of Sunderland, Sonny for Sunderland. It was perhaps the most ironic nickname in aristocratic history because there was nothing sunny about his personality. The Duke was cold, formal, and obsessed with propriety. He cared deeply about his position and his heritage. He took his role as Duke of Marlborough very seriously, but he had absolutely no interest in his American wife as a person. Remember, on their wedding day, after the ceremony, he had told her he was in love with another woman and that he despised anything that was not British. That set the tone for their entire marriage. The woman he loved was Gladys Deacon, another American, ironically, though one who had lived in Europe for years and had thoroughly adopted European ways. Gladys was beautiful, intellectual, and sophisticated. She was everything the Duke admired, but she did not have money, and the Duke needed money more than he needed love. So he married Consuelo for her fortune, and continued tea. Oh, pine for Gladys. He made no effort to hide this from Consuelo. He was not cruel in an active way. He was simply indifferent, cold, distant. He treated Consul with the kind of polite formality you might show to a business associate, not a wife. Their daily life reflected this emotional distance. The Duke had his routines and his interests. He was involved in politics, serving in the House of Lords. He was passionate about maintaining Blenheim and managing his estates. He spent time with his aristocratic friends hunting and attending the social functions that his position demanded. Consul was expected to fulfill her role as Duchess. She had official duties. She had to entertain important guests at Blenheim. She had to be presented at court, curtsying to Queen Victoria, and later King Edward II. She had to attend balls and dinners and weekend house parties. She had to dress appropriately, say the right things, maintain the dignity of the Mara name, but there was no warmth in any of it, no cabinship. The Duke would sometimes gober eyes without really speaking to her, beyond the minimum required by courtesy. Hay lived in the same palace, but inhabited essentially separate worlds. N.D. Consul could not even find comfort in familiar things, because everything at Blenheim was foreign to her. The food as English, the customs were English, the servants, all 300 of them, were English, and many of them viewed the new American Duchess with barely concealed disdain. She represented everything the had been raised to look down upon. New money, American manners, colonial vulgarity. Can you imagine what that UST have felt like? You're 18 years old. You are thousands of miles from your home and family. Your husband, greets you with cold politeness at best. Your mother-in-law views you as a necessary evil. The servants think you, vulgar, and you are living in a palace so large and so cold that you can go hours without seeing another human being if you want to. Consul later wrote that the heavy tiara she was required to wear at formal events invariably gave her violent headaches. The elaborate jewelry, the strings of pearls, the ceremonial dress, all of it was physically painful to wear. She described herself as being dressed like a doll, adorned with jewels that gave her no pleasure, performing a role in a play she had never wanted to be in. But she did find some solace, and this is important to note. She threw herself into charitable work. This was expected of women in her position. Of course, aristocratic ladies were supposed to be involved in charity to show benevolent concern for the less fortunate, but for Consuelo, it became more than just duty. It became a lifeline. She worked with the organizations that helped poor children. She visited hospitals. She supported educational initiatives, and in this work she found a kind of purpose that her marriage and her role as Duchess could not provide. When she was helping others, she could forget, at least for a while, her own misery. She also found one genuine friend in England, the Duke's cousin Winston Churchill. Winston, unlike his cousin the Duke, actually liked Consuelo. He found her intelligent and kind. They would have long conversations about books, about politics, about ideas. Winston was ambitious, brilliant, and frustrated by his lack of money and position. Consul was wealthy, positioned, and frustrated by her lack of freedom and happiness. They understood each other. And there is an interesting historical footnote here. Consul's marriage to the Duke and the subsequent birth of her sons actually freed Winston to pursue his political career. If the Duke had died without heirs, Winston would have inherited Blenheim Palace and the dukedom. He would have been trapped by the responsibility of managing the estate. Instead, with the succession secured, Winston could throw himself into politics without worrying about potentially inheriting a crumbling palace. So, in a strange way, Consuelo's unhappiness enabled Winston Churchill's career. History is full of these odd connections, is it not? But let us return to Consul's daily life, because I want you to really understand what she was going through. She would wake up in her bedroom, which was grand and beautifully furnished, but cold and lonely. She would be helped to dress by her lady's maid, putting on the elaborate clothing required for breakfast. Yes, there were rules about what you wore to breakfast. You could not just throw on comfortable clothes and have coffee in your bathrobe. Everything was formal. Breakfast would be in the dining room, often with various guests who might be staying at the palace. The Duke might or might not attend depending on his schedule. Conversation would be polite but distant. After breakfast, Consuelo would attend to correspondence, respond to social invitations, manage household affairs, then perhaps a walk in the grounds, which were admittedly beautiful. Blenheim sat on 2,000 acres of parkland designed by the famous landscape architect Capability Brown. There was a lake, gardens, wooded areas. On a sunny day it could almost be pleasant, but even beauty becomes oppressive when it is also your prison. Lunch again formal, again following strict rules of etiquette. Afternoon might involve receiving visitors or making visits herself, all carefully choreographed according to social protocols. Tea in the afternoon, of course, with more visitors or family members. Then the elaborate ritual of dressing for dinner, which required changing into full evening dress, even if you were just dining with your husband. Dinner itself could last for hours, with multiple courses served slow. Lie by an army of servants. If there were guests, Consul would have to make conversation, be charming, be the perfect hostess. If there were no guests, she and the Duke might eat in near silence, and then finally, mercifully, she could retire to her bedroom alone, always alone. The Duke had his own bedroom. Of course, separate bedrooms were standard for aristocratic couples. They would come together when necessary for the production of heirs, but otherwise they lived separate lives, even within their shared palace. This was Canuelo's life, day after day, week after week, year after year. A gilded cage indeed. She had everything money could buy, jewels worth millions, servants to attend to her every need, a title that opened every door in society, but she had no freedom, no love, no happiness. And here is what makes this story even more painful. She could not leave. Divorce in the 1890s, especially in British aristocratic circles, was almost unthinkable. It would have been a scandal that would have ruined her. She would have been cut off from society. Her children might have been taken from her. Her family would have been disgraced. So she stayed. She performed her role. She smiled at the right times, said the right things, wore the right clothes. She was, by all outward appearances, the perfect Duchess. But inside she was dying a little bit every day. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation you could not escape? Maybe a job you hated but needed for the money, a relationship that was making you miserable but you felt too scared to leave, a commitment you had made that you regretted but felt obligated to honor. If you have ever felt that kind of trapped desperation, then you can begin to understand what Consuelo was experiencing. But multiply it by 1,000, because she was not just trapped in a bad marriage. She was trapped in a foreign country, in a role that came WI. Enormous public scrutiny, with a husband who was indifferent to her suffering in a system that gave her no legal rights or recourse. And back in America, her mother Alva was probably telling herself that she had done the right thing, that she had secured her daughter's future, that Consuelo would thank her someday for pushing her into this advantageous match. It is amazing, is it not, how we can convince ourselves that our cruelty is actually kindness, how we can inflict suffering on the people we love and tell ourselves it is for their own good. But something was about to happen that would begin to crack the facade. Not immediately, not in a dramatic explosion, but slowly over years both Canuelo and Alva would begin to question the choices they had made and the prices they had paid. And eventually both women would find the courage to do something that Gilded Age society said was impossible. They would reclaim their own lives regardless of the cost. But before we get to that story of liberation, we need to understand what was happening to everyone else. Because, while Consul was suffering in her palace back in America, the entire economic system that had created all this wealth was beginning to shake. The Gilded Age was about to show its cracks, and those financial earthquakes would prove that even the richest women in America were never as secure as they thought. While Consuelo was learning to navigate the cold corridors of Blenheim Palace back in the United States, something far more terrifying than an unhappy marriage was brewing. The American economy, that great engine of wealth creation that had made families like the Vanderbilts possible, was about to reveal just how fragile it really was. And when it collapsed, it would take down not just businesses and banks, but families, reputations, and the illusion of security that even the wealthiest women clung to. Let me take you to New York City on May 5th, 1893. It is a spring morning, and on the surface everything seems normal. The streets are bustling, horse-drawn, carriages clatter past, the new elevated trains rattle overhead, people are going about their business. But if you know where to look, you can see the signs of panic beginning to spread. On Wall Street, something extraordinary is happening. The stock market is in freefall, banks are running out of cash, and whispers are starting to spread through the financial district like wildfire. A panic is coming. Now, you've probably heard about the Great Depression of the 1930s. Most people have. But what you might not know is that there was another depression, almost as severe, that hit America in the 1890s. It was called the Panic of 1893, and it was the worst economic crisis the United States had experienced up to that point. Let me give you some numbers to help you understand the scale of this disaster. By the end of 1893, over 15,000 businesses had gone bankrupt. 15,500 banks failed, taking with them the life savings of millions of depositors. The unemployment rate climbed to between 15% and 20%, which in some cities was even higher, reaching 25% to 30%. But these are just statistics. Let me tell you what this actually meant for real people. Imagine you are a middle-class family in New York in 1893. Your father has worked for the same company for 20 years. You have some money saved in the local bank. You own your home, or at least you're paying a mortgage on it. You feel secure. Then one day, your father comes home and tells you the company has shut down. He has no job. The bank where your savings were kept has closed its doors. All your money is gone. The mortgage payment is due, but you have no way to pay it. Within weeks, you could be homeless. This was not a hypothetical scenario. This happened to thousands of Fami. Lies across America in 1893. In New York City, soup kitchens were set up to feed the unemployed. Lines of hungry people stretched for blocks. Men who had been respectable workers just months before were now begging for food. Families that had owned homes were living in the streets or in makeshift shanties. And here is what made this panic particularly terrifying. Nobody really understood what was happening or how to stop it. The United States did not have a central bank at this time. There was no Federal Reserve to step in and stabilize the financial system. There was no unemployment insurance, no social safety net. When the economy collapsed, people were on their own. So what caused this disaster? Well, it was complicated, as these things always are, but let me try to explain it in a way that makes sense. First, there was a crisis with the gold supply. At this time, the United States was on the gold standard, which meant that every dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by gold reserves held by the Treasury. But in the early 1890s, the Treasury's gold reserves started dropping. They went from $190 million in 1890 to barely $100 million by 1893. Why does this matter? Because if people believe the government might run out of gold, they would lose faith in the value of American currency. And once people lose faith in money, the entire system can collapse. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everyone believes the dollar will become worthless, everyone tries to convert their dollars to gold or other assets, which actually does make the dollar worthless. Second, there were problems in the railroad industry. Railroads had been the hot investment of the Gilded Age. Everyone wanted to invest in railroads. Banks loaned enormous sums to railroad companies. But many of these railroads had been built speculatively without solid business plans. They were not making money. And when they started to fail, they took the banks that had loaned the money down with them. On February 20th, 1893, 12 days before President Grover Cleveland's inauguration, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy. This was not just any railroad. It was one of the largest in the country. Its failure sent shockwaves through the financial system. Third, there was an international dimension to the crisis. The economy was increasingly global. Even in the 1890s, when banks in Europe started calling in their loans from American borrowers, it put additional strain on the American financial system. European investors worried about the stability of the American economy started pulling their money out. This created even more pressure. And fourth, there was what we might call a crisis of confidence. Once panic starts, it feeds on itself. People hear that banks are failing, so they rush to withdraw their money from their own banks. But banks do not keep all their depositors' money in the vault. They loan most of it out. So when everyone tries to withdraw at once, the bank literally runs out of cash. Even if the bank was fundamentally sound, this is called a bank run, and it is absolutely devastating. In the spring and summer of 1893, bank runs happened all across the country. People would line up outside banks before dawn, desperate to get their money out before the bank failed. The lucky ones got their money. The unlucky ones, sometimes just minutes too late, lost everything. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what does this have to do with wealthy women in ballrooms, the Vanderbilts and the Ayers? Surely they were protected from this kind of thing. And you would be partly right. The very wealthiest families did not suffer the way middle-class and working-class families did. They did not end up in breadlines. But the panic of 1893 did affect them in ways teeth had exposed just how vulnerable even great wealth could be. First, there was the psychological impact. Even if your family fortune survived, you watched friends and associates go bankrupt. You saw men you had dined with last month now ruined, sometimes driven to suicide by their losses. The illusion of permanence, the belief that wealth once acquired would last forever, was shattered. Second, there were actual financial losses even for the wealthy. Stock portfolios plummeted, real estate values dropped, business investments that had seemed so turned out to be worthless. A family that was worth $50 million one year might find itself worth only $20 million the next year. Still wealthy by any measure, but the loss of more than half your wealth is psychologically devastating. Third, and this is particularly relevant, for women, the panic exposed how little control women had over their own financial security. In the Gilded Age, married women had very limited legal rights to property. Most family wealth was controlled by men, by the husbands and fathers. Women might live in luxury, but they did so at the pleasure of the men who controlled the money. When a husband lost his fortune in a panic, his wife lost everything too, regardless of whether she had brought money to the marriage or not, and she often had no warning. Many women discovered their families were bankrupt only when the servants were let go or the creditors came to seize the furniture. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates this vulnerability. In Portland, Oregon, which had experienced its own boom during the Gilded Age based on timber and shipping, the panic of 1893 was absolutely devastating. Portland had grown rapidly in the 1880s and early 1890s. Fortunes had been made, grand houses had been built, the city had a thriving social scene with its own version of the 400. When the panic hit, banks in. Portland failed rapidly. The real estate market collapsed. Timber companies went bankrupt, and families that had been wealthy one month were selling their furniture the next. There was a woman, a prominent Portland socialite, whose husband had made a fortune in real estate speculation. She had no idea that his wealth was almost entirely based on loans and leveraged investments. She thought they were rich. She entertained lavishly. She wore expensive gowns. She was on all the important guest lists. And then one day, her husband came home and told her they'd lost everything. The banks had called in his loans. His real estate holdings had become unsellable. They were bankrupt. Within weeks, they had to sell their house, let go all the servants, and move into modest rented rooms. She went from ballrooms to near poverty in less than a month. This kind of story repeated itself across the country during the Panic of 1893, and it revealed a fundamental truth about the position of women in Gilded Age society. No matter how luxurious their lives appeared, they were always one financial disaster away from losing everything because they had no independent control over their own economic security. Now, you might remember that we talked about Theresa Fair Ulrichs, one of the women who would later be part of the triumvirate that replaced Mrs. Astor. Theresa's story is particularly interesting in the context of financial instability. Theresa's father, James Graham Fair, was an Irish immigrant who had discovered the Comstock lode in Nevada in 1873. This was one of the richest deposits of gold and silver ever found in the United States. Over $100 million worth of precious metals, which is over $3 billion today, were extracted from the Comstock lode. James Farr became enormously wealthy. He used his mining fortune to invest in railroads and real estate, building his wealth to an estimated $50 million by the time of his death. His daughter Theresa, nicknamed Tessie, married Herman Earl Ricks, a steamship tycoon, in 1890 and became one of Newport's leading hostesses. But even this enormous fortune was not as secure as it seemed. When Herman Elricks died suddenly of a heart attack, Theresa discovered that most of his fortune was going to his brother, not to her. Herman Annan had apparently believed that Theresa, with her own inherited wealth, did not need his money. But Theresa had to sue to get even half of what should have been her husband's estate. Think about that for a moment. Here was a woman whose father was worth $50 million, whose husband was worth additional millions, who lived in a mansion in Newport and wore jewels worth a fortune. And yet, when her husband died, she had to go to court to fight for financial security. Even at the very top of society, women's economic position was precarious. The Panic of 1893 was followed by a depression that lasted for years. The economy did not really recover until 1897. 4 years of hardship, 4 years of uncertainty, 4 years when even the wealthy felt vulnerable. And then just 10 years later, it happened again. The Panic of 1907 was another massive financial crisis. This time it started with a failed attempt to corner the copper market by two speculators, F. Augustus Heinesse and Charles W. Morse. When their scheme collapsed, it triggered runs on banks and trust companies. Once again, the financial system teetered on the edge of total collapse. This panic was only stopped when J.P. Morgan, the legendary banker, essentially acted as a one-man central bank. He organized the other major banks to pool their resources and provide liquidity to failing institutions. Morgan spent days locked in his library with other financiers, hammering out deals to save the financial system. It was an extraordinary display of private power, stepping in where government could not. But here is what is important. Even Morgan could not prevent all the damage. Banks still failed. Businesses still went bankrupt. People still lost their savings. And once again, it was demonstrated that in the American economic system of the early 1900s, financial security was an illusion. Even great wealth could evaporate overnight. For women, these repeated financial crises created a particular kind of anxiety. They watched fortunes rise and fall. They saw families go from wealth to bankruptcy and sometimes back to wealth again. They understood at a visceral level that the comfortable lives they were living depended on forces they could not control and often could not even understand. This is part of why women like Alva Vanderbilt were so obsessed with securing their daughters' futures through advantageous marriages. A title was forever. A British duke might be poor, but he would always be a duke. The social position that came with aristocratic marriage seemed more permanent, more secure than wealth that could disappear in a banking panic. But as Consul was discovering at Blenheim Palace, that security came at an enormous emotional cost. And as Alva herself was about to discover, financial security was not the only kind of security that mattered. Because while the American economy was experiencing these terrifying boom and bust cycles, Alva's own life was about to go through its own kind of panic. Her marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt, which had seemed so solid, which had been the foundation of her social triumph, was about to explode in a scandal that would make the financial panics look tame by comparison. And when it did, Alva would discover that in Gilded Age society, a divorced woman faced her own kind of bankruptcy, a social and reputational collapse that no amount of money could entirely prevent. But here is the fascinating thing. Alva's divorce, her willingness to break one of society's most sacred rules, would actually begin to change the rules themselves. Because sometimes, the most important revolutions do not happen in the streets or in the voting booth. They happen when one person, usually a woman, says, "I have had enough," and walks away from a life that is killing her soul, regardless of what society says she should do. The scandal broke in the summer of 1894, and New York society practically vibrated with shock. Whispers turned into gossip. Gossip turned into newspaper headlines, and suddenly everyone was talking about the unthinkable. Alva Vanderbilt and her husband Willie were having what the papers delicately called domestic difficulties. In Gilded Age society, this was the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off. Divorce among the very wealthy was not just rare, it was almost unheard of. It was considered a moral failure, a public humiliation, a stain on an entire family's reputation. Nice people simply did not get divorced. They might be miserable in their marriages. They might maintain separate lives. They might even have affairs, but they stayed married. Appearances were everything, and yet Alva Vanderbilt, who had fought so hard to break into society, who had thrown that legendary party to force Mrs. Atoll's acknowledgement, who had married her daughter to a duke, was about to do the unthinkable. She was about to become a divorced woman. Let me tell you how it happened, because the details reveal so much about the world these people inhabited. The marriage between Alva and Willie had never been particularly happy. Willie was charming but aimless, more interested in yachts and horses than in any serious pursuits. Alva was driven and ambitious, constantly pushing for more recognition, more status, more everything. They had 3 children together, Consuelo, whom we have been discussing, and 2 sons, William Kissam Vanderbilt Jr. and Harold Sterling Vanderbilt. But having children did not make the marriage satisfying. By the early 1890s, Willie had apparently taken up with a woman named Nellie Nuata. She was described in contemporary accounts as a Paris socialite, which was polite code for a woman of questionable respectability. Willie was spending time with her in Europe, being indiscreet enough that rumors were circulating. Now, here is where the story gets interesting, because there are 2 theories about what really happened. The first theory, the one that was widely believed at the time, was that Willie genuinely had an affair. Alva found out, and she was so outraged that she demanded a divorce. The second theory, which some historians find more plausible, is that the whole thing was staged, that Alva wanted out of the marriage and convinced Willie to have a public affair, or at least the appearance of one, so that she could divorce him on the grounds of adultery without being blamed herself. Why would Alva want out? Well, by 1895 she had achieved everything she had married Willie to achieve. She had social position, she had wealth. Her daughter was about to become a duchess. The marriage had served its purpose and now was just a burden. Willie was not particularly interested in Alva's projects and ambitions. They had grown apart, if they had ever been together in any meaningful sense, and there might have been another factor. Alva had apparently developed feelings for Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a family friend and fellow member of New York society. Oliver was himself divorced, having left his first wife after she allegedly had an affair. He was wealthy, cultured, and interested in the same social causes that Alva cared about, particularly women's suffrage. Whatever the truth behind the affair, the legal process moved forward with remarkable speed. On March 5, 1895, a New York Supreme Court justice granted Alva a divorce. The grounds were adultery. Willie did not contest it. Alva was awarded custody of their 3 children, permission to remarry in New York State, and a financial settlement. That was, even by Vanderbilt standards, eye-watering. The exact amount was never officially disclosed, but newspapers at the time estimated it at between $3 million and $10 million, which in today's money would be between $95 million and $380 million. Plus, Alva kept several properties, including Marble House in Newport, the country house on Long Island, and the mansion on Fifth Avenue. Think about that for a moment. Alva walked away from her marriage with hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money, multiple estates, custody of her children, and the legal right to remarry. By the standards of the time, this was an extraordinary settlement. Most divorced women were lucky to get minimal support and often lost custody of their children. But the money could not protect Alva from the social consequences, and those consequences were swift and brutal. The day the divorce was announced, Alva went from being one of the New York's most prominent hostesses to being essentially a social pariah. Women who had attended her parties now refused to acknowledge her on the street. Invitations to social events dried up. People who had been her friends suddenly became too busy to see her. The New York Tribune described the divorce as one of the most remarkable things that had occurred in some time, noting that it affected every class of society. The World newspaper run by Joseph Pulitzer went even further, suggesting that the divorce was full of meaning for everyone, from the richest to the poorest in society. But the reaction that must have hurt Alva most was from her own social circle. Remember, Alva had fought for years to be accepted by old money society. She had spent fortunes, thrown legendary parties, married her daughter to a duke, all to secure her position, and now, with one divorce decree, it was all threatened. Mrs. Astor predictably dropped Alva like a hot potato. The matriarch of New York society made it clear that a divorced woman, no matter how wealthy, was not welcome in her drawing room. Other old money families followed suit. The doors that Alva had worked so hard to open were slamming shut. And here is the truly fascinating part. Alva did not seem to care as much as everyone expected. She had spent so many years courting society's approval, but now, when she lost it, she appeared almost liberated. It was as if the divorce had freed her, not just from Willie, but from the constant need to please people who would never truly accept her anyway. Just 10 months after her divorce was finalized on January 11th, 1896, Alva married Oliver Belmont. The wedding was quiet, nothing like the spectacle of her first marriage, but it was also defiant. She was making it clear that she would live her life on her own terms, regardless of what society thought. Now, marrying Oliver should have made things worse from a social standpoint. He was divorced, she was divorced, they were both technically disgraced. But something interesting happened instead. Because Oliver's family was old money, because he had impeccable social credentials despite his divorce, and because Alva simply refused to act ashamed, society gradually began to accept them. It helped that Alva had become incredibly wealthy in her own right through the divorce settlement. Money, as always, had a way of making social sins more forgivable. If you are rich enough, society will eventually invite you back to the party, even if they gossip about you behind your back. But Alva's second marriage to Oliver Belmont Revere led something that would have shocked the young woman who had married Willie Vanderbilt 20 years earlier. Oliver, it turned out, was not the Prince Charming he had seemed. He had problems of his own. He drank heavily, favoring absinthe, that notorious green liquor that was popular among bohemians and artists. His first marriage had ended badly with allegations of physical abuse, and his relationship with Alva, while perhaps more intellectually compatible than her first marriage, was also troubled. Oliver had his own demons, his own controlling tendencies. Alva, who had fought so hard for independence, found herself in another complicated relationship. But there was one crucial difference. This time, Alva had her own money. She was not dependent on Oliver for her financial security. She had properties in her own name. She had investments. She had control. And this financial independence changed everything. It meant she could pursue her own interests without needing anyone's permission. And the interests that Alva began to pursue in the late 1890s were revolutionary. She became involved in the women's suffrage movement. not just casually involved, but passionately, obsessively committed to the cause of women's right to vote. This transformation from social climber to political activist is one of the most fascinating aspects of Alva's story. The woman who had once cared only about getting into Mrs. A's ballroom now cared about changing the fundamental structure of society. The woman who had forced her daughter into a loveless marriage now fought for women's right to control their own lives. What caused this change? Some historians believe it was guilt over what she had done to Consuelo. Others think it was the experience of divorce, of being suddenly cast out of society that made her realize how little power women actually had. Still others suggest that she had always had Hesse beliefs, but had suppressed them while she was focused on social climbing. I think it was probably all of these things. Alva was complicated, contradictory, capable of both great cruelty and great courage. She could manipulate her daughter ruthlessly and also fight passionately for women's rights. She contained multitudes, as we all do. By the early 1900s, Alva was one of the most prominent suffragists in America. When Oliver Belmont died in 1908, Alva threw herself even more fully into the cause. She donated enormous sums of money to suffrage organizations. She organized marches and rallies. In January 1917, she did something that shocked even her supporters. She organized the first ever picketing of the White House. Can you imagine? Women, respectable women, some of them from wealthy families, standing outside the White House with signs demanding the right to vote. This was radical stuff. It was controversial. It was effective. Alva was eventually elected president of the National Women's Party, a position she held until her death. She purchased their headquarters in Washington, a building that is now the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. Her legacy in the suffrage movement is substantial and undeniable. But let us not romanticize this too much. Alva's feminism was complicated. She fought for women's right to vote, for women's right to own property, for women's right to divorce. But she had forced her own daughter into marriage. She had used her wealth and power to control Consuel's life in ways that were fundamentally at odds with feminist principles. This contradiction tells us something important about the Gilded Age and about human nature more generally. People are complicated. They can hold contradictory views. They can be both oppressor and liberator. Alva fought for women's freedom in the abstract while denying freedom to her own door. Ter in particular. And Consuelo, how did she react to her mother's divorce and remarriage? Remember, Consuel's wedding to the Duke of Marlborough took place in November 1895, just 8 months after Alva's divorce was finalized. So Consuelo was essentially forced into a permanent marriage to preserve her mother's social standing, and then her mother turned around and got divorced anyway. The irony must have been crushing. Consuel had sacrificed her happiness, her love for Winthrop Rutherford, her entire future, all to avoid scandalizing society. And then Alva, who had desisted on this sacrifice, went ahead and scandalized society herself. But Consuelo, trapped in England with a husband she did not love, could not act on her resentment. She could not get divorced herself, not yet. British society was even more rigid about divorce than American society, and she had children now, sons who would inherit the dukedom. She felt trapped by duty, by social expectations, by the very marriage her mother had forced on her. For years, Consuelo and Alva's relationship was strained, perhaps even broken. They corresponded because that was expected, but the warmth was gone. Consuel must have felt betrayed on multiple levels. Her mother had controlled every aspect of her life, had forced her into a miserable marriage, and then freed herself while leaving Consuelo trapped. But here is where the story takes another turn, because human relationships are never simple. Despite everything, despite the manipulation and the forced marriage and the years of unhappiness, Consuelo and Alva would eventually reconcile. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually they would find their way back to something that resembled love, or at least understanding. that reconciliation would come later, after more years of unhappiness for Consuelo, after more changes in society's attitudes toward divorce, after both women had learned painful lessons about the cost of control and the value of freedom. But before we get to that redemption story, we need to understand what was happening to the other women in this world. Because while Alva was getting divorced and Consuelo was suffering in England, there were other women navigating the treacherous waters of Gilded Age society. Women like my fish who threw parties where guests could only speak in baby talk. Women like Tessie Olry who went from Nevada mining camps to Newport mansions. Women who together with Alva would form a triumvirate of power after Mrs. A's death, ruling New York society with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves and diamond bracelets when Mrs. Caroline Sherahorn died on October 30th, 1908 at the age of 78. It marked the end of an era. The woman who had ruled New York society for decades, who had decided with a nod or a snub who mattered and who did not, was gone. And suddenly there was a power vacuum at the very top of American high society. Nature abhors a vacuum and so does society. Within months, 3 women emerged to fill the void left by Mrs. A's death. They were known as the triumvirate, and they could not have been more different from each other or from the woman they replaced. There was my fish, the eccentric party thrower, who delighted in breaking every rule of conventional entertaining. There was Teresa Fair Wells, called Tessie, the daughter of an Irish immigrant miner who had struck it rich, beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And there was Alva, now Alva Belmont. After her remarriage, the social climber turned suffragist who had fought her way to the top and refused to leave. Let me introduce you properly to these 3 remarkable women, because their stories revealed just how much American society was changing even as it tried desperately to stay the same. First, there was my fish, born Marion Graves, anon in 1853. She came from respectable New York society, not the very top tier, but solid, comfortable old money. She married Sterrant Fish, who would eventually become president of the Illinois Central Railroad in 1876. The marriage gave her access to enormous wealth and the freedom to do something that very few society women dared. She decided to have fun. Now, when I say my fish liked to have fun, I need you to understand that in the context of Gilded Age society, this was radical. Mrs. Ayres's parties had been elegant, formal, carefully choreographed affairs. Everything had rules. Everything had its proper place. You dressed a certain way, behaved a certain way, spoke about certain acceptable topics in certain acceptable tones. My fish threw those rules out the window and then set the window on fire for good measure. She became famous, or perhaps infamous, for her outrageous-themed parties. At one party, she insisted that all guests could only speak in baby talk to each other. Grown men and women, some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in America, standing around going goo-gaga at each other because my fish said so. Can you imagine? It must have been simultaneously hilarious and deeply uncomfortable. At another party, she had elephants roaming the grounds of her estate, and guests were invited to feed them peanuts. Yet another, everyone had to dress as dolls and behave like toys. These were not just parties, they were performance art, social commentary, and pure chaos, all rolled into one. But here is what made my fish interesting. Beneath the eccentric behavior was a sharp intelligence and a wicked sense of humor. She understood that the rigid formality of old money society was becoming outdated, even absurd. She knew that the younger generation was bored with the endless rules and restrictions, so she gave them permission to be ridiculous, to laugh, to break the rule, in controlled environments where it was safe to do so. She was also known for her sharp tongue. She could be cruel in her wit. She had feuds with other society women, including at various times both of her fellow triumvirate members. But people tolerated her eccentricity because she was entertaining, because she was married to a railroad president, and because, quite frankly, her parties were the most fun anyone in that stifling society was allowed to have. However, my fish had her limits. Despite her eccentric behavior, she was deeply conservative on certain issues. She was surprisingly against women's suffrage. She believed that women already had plenty of power through their social influence and did not need the vote. She once declared that a good husband is the best right of any woman, a statement that must have made Alva Belmont want to throw something at her. My fish died suddenly in 1915 at the age of 61. Some said it was heart failure. Others whispered that the stress of maintaining her position in society, of constantly outdoing herself with more outrageous entertainments, had simply worn her out. Either way, she left behind a legacy of parties that people talked about for decades. Then there was Theresa Fair Elriggs, and her story is perhaps the most American of all the Gilded Age tales because it is a rags-to-riches story that sounds too dramatic to be true, but absolutely was. Tessie was born in Nevada in 1871, not in a mansion or even a comfortable home. She was born in a mining camp. Her father, James Graham Fair, was an Irish immigrant who had arrived in America at age 12 in 1843. He worked in the California gold mines, then moved to Nevada when silver was discovered there. For years, James Farr was just another prospector hoping to strike it rich, but mostly just scraping by. And then, in 1873, when Tessie was only 2 years old, everything changed. James Fair and 3 partners discovered what would become known as the Big Bonanza, the largest single deposit of gold and silver ever found in North America. Let me give you some numbers so you can understand the scale of this discovery. Over $100 million worth of gold and silver, which is over $3 billion in today's money, was eventually extracted from the Comstock lode. James Farr's share of this made him one of the wealthiest men in America, with a personal fortune estimated at $50 million. But here is the sad part of Tessie's childhood. Her parents' marriage was miserable. Her mother, Theresa Rooney Fair, was an innkeeper's daughter who had married James when he was still poor. As James became rich, he became cruel. He was unfaithful, controlling, and apparently quite unpleasant to live with. In 1883, when Tessie was 12, her mother divorced him, which was scandalous enough. But then the divorce got ugly with public accusations and legal battles over money. As part of the divorce settlement, Theresa Rooney Fair received $5 million, which is about $160 million today, and custody of the children. She took her daughters to Newport, Rhode Island for summer vacations, and it was there in the playgrounds of the wealthy that young Tessie met her future husband. Herman Earl Ricks was a steamship tycoon, heir to a shipping fortune. He was handsome, cultured, and apparently quite charming. He and Tessie were married in 1890 when she was 19 years old. They purchased an estate in Newport and commissioned the famous architectural firm of Miss Kimmy and Whiteborough. Designed them a mansion that would rival anything else in that playground of the rich. The result was Rosecliff, a stunning white mansion modeled after the Granborough Ryan at the Palace of Versailles. It had a ballroom that could accommodate 300 guests. The entire house was designed for entertaining on a grand scale, and Tessie threw herself into the role of Newport hostess with tremendous energy. She hosted ballets, operas, even a circus on the grounds of Rosecliff. She became known as the enforcer of the triumvirate, the one who made sure everyone followed the rules of proper behavior. Where my fish broke rules for fun and Alva Belmont broke them for political purposes, Tessie O'Leary maintained them with an iron will. She was, in the words of one contemporary, the drill sergeant of high society. But Tessie's life was not as secure as it appeared. Her marriage to Herman was troubled. They argued frequently, and when Herman died, suddenly of a heart attack, Tessie discovered something shocking. Most of his fortune was going to his brother, not to her. Herman had apparently believed that Tessie, with her own inherited wealth from her father, did not need his money. Tessie had to sue to get even half of Herman Saund's estate. Here was a woman whose father had been one of the richest men in America, who had married another wealthy man, who lived in a palace and wore jewels worth a fortune. And yet she had to go to court to fight for financial security after her husband's death. It perfectly illustrates the vulnerability of even the wealthiest women in this era. After winning her legal battle, Tessie continued to reign over Newport society. But she also, like Alva, became involved in causes. She worked with the Red Cross, marching with other society women to raise money and awareness. She devoted significant energy to charitable work, perhaps finding in service to others the meaning that her social position alone could not provide. And then there was Alva, who by 1908 had transformed herself from social climber to social revolutionary. As we discussed, Alva had gone through her own divorce, remarried Oliver Belelmont, and thrown herself into the suffrage movement. After Oliver's death, in 1908, the same year Mrs. Astor died, Alva became even more radical in her political activism. The three women, Tessie and Alva, formed an unlikely alliance at the top of New York and Newport society. They did not always like each other. They had different priorities and different approaches to life, but together they represented the changing face of American high society in the early 1900s, where Mrs. Astor had represented old money tradition, careful preservation of the social order, and rigid adherence to rules. The triumvirate represented something more complex. They were all wealthy. Yes, they all cared about social position, but they were also more diverse in their backgrounds, more willing to bend or break rules, more engaged with the world beyond their ballrooms. My fish represented the idea that society could be fun, even ridiculous. Tessie Ulrich's represented the American dream, the idea that even someone born in a mining camp could rise to the very top of society. And Alva Belmont represented the possibility of transformation, the idea that you could reinvent yourself, that your life at 50 did not have to look like your life at 30. But ruling society from the top gave these three women a view of something that was becoming increasingly obvious by the early 1900s. The entire system was unsustainable. The cost of maintaining these lifestyles, of keeping up appearances, of competing in an ever-escalating arms race, of conspicuous consumption was staggering, and not everyone could keep up. Let me tell you about the hidden costs of being a Gilded Age society woman, because behind the glittering facade there was a constant, grinding anxiety about money. First, there were the clothes. Fashion in the Gilded Age was insanely expensive. A single gown from a top Paris designer like Charles Frederick Worth could cost the equivalent of $350,000 today, and you could not wear the same gown twice to important events. That was considered a terrible far. So a society woman needed dozens of gowns for a single season. The cost for one season's wardrobe could easily exceed several $1 million in today's money. Then there were the jewels. Women competed to have the most spectacular jewelry. Diamonds, pearls, emeralds, rubies, pieces designed by the finest jewelers in Europe, tiaras so heavy they caused headaches, necklaces worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The insurance costs alone were astronomical. There were the multiple residences, a mansion in New York for the winter season, a cottage, meaning a 50-room mansion in Newport for the summer, perhaps a property in Europe for the grand tour. Each residence required full-time staff, even when the family was not in residence. Each required maintenance, repairs, updating. The carrying costs were enormous. Speaking of staff, the number of servants required to maintain a Gilded Age household was staggering. Blenheim Palace employed 300 people. American mansions might employ 50 to 100 servants. Butlers, footmen, maids, cooks, laundresses, gardeners, stable hands, drivers, all of them needed salaries, housing, food, uniforms. The annual cost of maintaining a household staff could exceed several $1 million in today's money. Then there was entertainment, the parties. A single elaborate party could cost the equivalent of 5 to 10 million today, and you could not just throw one party a season. You had to throw multiple parties each one trying to outdo the last. The flowers alone for a major party could cost tens of thousands of dollars. The food, the wine, the entertainment, the decorations, it all added up. And here is the thing that makes this particularly anxiety-inducing. You could never stop. Once you were in the game, you had to keep playing. If you stopped throwing parties, people would assume you had lost your money. If you started economizing on clothes or jewels or household staff, rumors would spread that you were in financial trouble. And once those rumors started, your social position would begin to crumble. So even families with enormous fortunes felt the pressure. They were locked into a system of competitive consumption where the stakes kept rising and rising. And some families, even very wealthy families, could not keep up. This is why Herman Earl Ricks's estate was not as large as expected when he died. He had been spending enormous sums to maintain multiple properties, throw lavish parties, keep up with the other millionaires. The income from his business could not quite keep pace with the expenditures required by a social position. This is why so many aristocratic families in Europe were desperate for American heiresses. The cost of maintaining castles and country estates, of keeping up appearances, was driving them into bankruptcy. They needed infusions of American capital just to survive. And this is why the financial panics we discussed earlier were so terrifying even for the very wealthy. When your entire social position depends on maintaining an impossibly expensive lifestyle, any threat to your income is an existential threat. By the early 1900s, cracks were showing in the Gilded Age system. The progressive movement was gaining strength, pushing for reforms, for higher taxes on the wealthy, for regulations on businesses. The suffrage movement, championed by Alva Belmont among others, was challenging traditional gender roles. Labor unions were organizing, demanding better wages and working conditions. The world was changing, and the gilded palaces of Newport were starting to look less like aspirational dream homes and more like embarrassing monuments to excess. But the women of the triumvirate could not see this yet, or perhaps they could see it but could not imagine any other way to live. They'd spent their entire lives in this system. It was all they knew. So they continued to throw their parties, wear their jewels, maintain their mansions, even as the costs kept rising and the returns kept diminishing. They were in a sense prisoners of their own success, trapped in golden cages that required constant exhausting maintenance just to avoid collapsing entirely. Everything came to a head for Consuelo in 1906, 11 years after that tearful wedding ceremony. 11 years of living in a palace that felt like a prison. 11 years of a marriage that was a marriage in name only. 11 years of performing the role of duchess while dying inside. And finally, she could not do it anymore. The separation when it came shocked British society almost as much as Alva's divorce had shocked American society. Dukes did not separate from their wives. It simply was not done. Yes, aristocratic couples might live essentially separate lives, might have affairs, might barely speak to each other, but they stayed married. The institution of marriage, particularly aristocratic marriage, was too important to the social order to allow for something as messy as separation or divorce. But Consuelo had reached her breaking point, and the Duke, who had never loved her anyway, was equally ready to be done with the charade. They had fulfilled their primary duty. They had produced 2 sons, ensuring the succession. The financial arrangements were secure. There was no practical reason to continue living together if they both found it unbearable. So in 1906, they formally separated. Consuelo moved out of Blenheim Palace. The Duke remained there, maintaining his position in his estates, and British society erupted in scandal. But here is what is important. Even though they separated in 1906, the actual divorce did not happen until 1921, 15 years later. Think about that. 15 years of being separated, but still legally married. 15 years of being in limbo, neither fully married nor fully free. Why did it take So long, well, divorce in Britain required an Act of Parliament until 1923. It was complicated, expensive, and carried enormous social stigma. The Duke apparently did not see the point of going through all that trouble. He had his life at Blenheim. He had his political career in the House of Lords. He had his relationship with Gladys Deacon, that woman he had been in love with all along. A legal divorce would not change any of that, and it might cause uncomfortable scrutiny. But Consuelo wanted the divorce for a very specific reason. She had fallen in love, again, finally at last. His name was Jacques Balsan. He was a French pilot and industrialist, heir to a textile fortune. And the beautiful, heartbreaking thing about this story is that Jack had been in love with Consuelo since before her marriage to the Duke. He had first seen her at a ball in Paris shortly before her 18th birthday. She was 17, beautiful, and already trapped by her mother's plans. And Jack, who was about 10 years older, fell for her immediately. But of course nothing could come of it then. Consul was being prepared for marriage to a duke. Jacques, while wealthy and respectable, was not aristocratic enough for Alva's ambitions, so they went their separate ways. Jack watched from afar as Consul married the Duke, moved to England, had children, and disappeared into her role as Duchess of Marlborough. And then, years later, after Consul had separated from the Duke, they met again, and Jack had never stopped loving her. Can you imagine? He had waited for her, in a sense, for over a decade, and now, finally, there was a possibility they could be together. But there was a problem, a big problem. Jacques' family was devoutly Roman Catholic, and the Catholic Church did not recognize divorce. Even if Consul divorced the Duke in civil court, the Church would still consider her married, and Jacques' family would not accept a wife who was divorced in the eyes of God. This is where the story takes a turn that reveals just how much Alva had changed and how the relationship between mother and daughter was beginning to heal, at least partially. In December 1925, Canuel wrote to Lucy J., that same woman who had been her mother's friend, and had delivered the message about Alva's supposed heart, Atta, all those years ago. Consul explained that she was seeking an annulment from the Catholic Church. Not a divorce, which the Church did not allow, but an annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. The grounds for the annulment would be coercion. Consul would have to prove that she had been forced into the marriage against her will, and to do that she needed her mother to testify. Now think about what this meant for Alva. She would have to publicly admit that she had forced her daughter into marriage. She would have to confess to using emotional manipulation threats and a fake heart attack to break her daughter's will. She would have to acknowledge in a legal proceeding that would become public record that she had been cruel and controlling. And Alva agreed to do it. In her testimony, which was given to a Catholic tribunal investigating the marriage, Alva made a statement that is both shocking and, in a strange way, admirable in its honesty. She said, and this is a direct quote, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." Let those words sink in for a moment. I have always had absolute power over my daughter. It is a confession of tyranny, an admission of abuse. And yet, in the context of securing Consuelo's freedom, it was also an act of maternal love, or at least of making amends. The Catholic Church granted the annulment on August 19, 1926. The marriage between Consuelo Vanderbilt and Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, was declared null and void. In the eyes of the Church, it had never existed. Interestingly, the annulment was also beneficial to the Duke. He had converted to Roman Catholicism after his second marriage to Gladys Deacon, whom he had finally married after divorcing Consuelo in 1921. But as a divorced man, he could not fully participate in the sacrament of the Church. The annulment changed that. It meant his first marriage had never been valid. So he was free to be a Catholic in good standing. And Consuelo She married Jacques Balsan shortly after the annulment was granted. She was 49 years old. She had waited over 30 years to marry for love, but finally, she was free. In her autobiography published in 1953 entitled The Glitter and the Gold, Consul described her life with Jacques as the true gold in contrast to the false glitter of her life as a duchess. They lived primarily in France in a beautiful chateau called Sonore Motel near Fontainebleau. They entertained friends including Winston Churchill and his wife Clementine, who visited regularly. They traveled, they enjoyed life, and most importantly, they enjoyed each other. Consul wrote that Jacques was everything she had dreamed a husband could be: kind, attentive, interesting, interested in her as a person rather than as a symbol or a source of income. After decades of emotional isolation, she finally had companionship. After years of performing a role, she could finally be herself. And here is another detail that speaks to Consul's character and her journey toward healing. Despite everything, she maintained relationships with members of the Spencer-Churchill family, particularly Winston. She bore no grudge against them for her unhappiness. She understood that the Duke had been as trapped by the system as she had been. He had needed money to save Blenheim. She had been the source of that money. The marriage had been a transaction, not a relationship, and both of them had suffered for it. But what about Alva? How did she fit into Consuelo's new life? Remarkably, Alva and Consuelo reconciled. Not immediately after the annulment, and not without difficulty, but over time they found their way back to something that resembled a loving relationship. Alva even bought a Chardonnay. Our Consuls in France, so she could be close to her daughter in Alva's later years. Think about the psychology of that reconciliation for a moment. Consuelo had every reason to hate her mother. Alva had controlled her childhood, beaten her, manipulated her, forced her into a loveless marriage, and caused her decades of unhappiness. By any measure, Alva's treatment of Consuelo was abusive, and yet Consuelo forgave her, or at least she chose to have a relationship with her mother despite everything. Why? I think part of it was that Consuelo understood as she got older that Alva's cruelty came from a place of fear and trauma. Alva had experienced financial insecurity at a young age. She had learned that the world was harsh and unforgiving, that women without money were vulnerable, that only position and wealth could provide safety, and in her twisted way she had been trying to protect Consuelo from the dangers she herself had faced. This does not excuse what Alva did. Understanding someone's motivations does not mean condoning their actions, but it fear perhaps made forgiveness possible, or at least made continued relationship possible. And there was something else. Alva, in her later years, had changed. Her work with the suffrage movement had transformed her. She had gone from caring only about social position to caring passionately about women's rights, about giving women the power to control their own lives. The irony of this transformation, given how she had controlled Canuel's life, was not lost on anyone, probably not even on Alva herself. In fact, Alva's testimony in the annulment proceeding can be seen as a kind of public penance. She was admitting her sins in a very public way. She was acknowledging that she had been wrong to force Consuelo into marriage. She was using her power and influence, which had once been used to trap Consuelo, to now set Consuelo free. It was not a full apology. Alva was not really capable of that kind of vulnerability. But it was an acknowledgement, and perhaps that was enough for Consuelo. Alva died in France in January 1933 at the age of 80. She was buried in New York, and her funeral was a remarkable affair. The pallbearers were all women, which was almost unheard of at the time. It was a final statement from Alva about women's equality, about women's strength, about women's ability to do anything men could do. Consul attended the funeral. Whatever complicated feelings she had about her mother, she was there at the end. And after Alva's death, Consuelo continued to live a full and active life. She did philanthropic work, particularly focused on children's welfare and housing reform. She divided her time between France and the United States. She maintained friendships across 2 continents. She wrote her memoir, reclaiming her own story and telling the truth about what had happened to her. She lived until 1964, dying at the age of 87. She had outlived both her husbands, her mother, and many of the people who'd been part of that glittering, cruel, Gilded Age world. She had survived forced marriage, emotional abuse, decades of unhappiness, and a soul-crushing social system. And in the end, she had found freedom, love, and a kind of peace. Her story and Alva's story are stories of both oppression and liberation. They show us the worst of what that era did to women, the way it trapped them, controlled them, traded them like commodities. But they also show us that even within that oppressive system, change was possible. Alva, who had been the instrument of her daughter's oppression, became a champion of women's freedom, and Suella, who had been forced into a gilded cage, eventually found the courage to leave it. These were not simple stories of villains and victims. They were complicated stories of complicated women. Navigating an impossible system, making terrible choices and brave choices, hurting each other, and eventually healing at least partially the wounds they had inflicted. And their stories raise questions that are still relevant today, are they not? How much should parents control their children's choices? When does protection become suffocation? How do we balance security with freedom? Can people really change, or do their fundamental natures remain constant? Is forgiveness always possible, or are some wounds too deep to heal? I do not have easy answers to these questions. I am not sure anyone does, but I think Canuelo and Alva's stories suggest that human beings are capable of both tremendous cruelty and tremendous courage, sometimes within the same person, sometimes within the same lifetime, and that even when we make terrible mistakes, even when we hurt the people we love most, there is still a possibility for redemption, for growth, for change. But their story is not the whole story. Because while Canuela was finding her freedom and Alva was transforming into a suffragist, the entire Gilded Age system was beginning to collapse. The excessive wealth, the obsessive consumption, the rigid social hierarchies, all of it was becoming unsustainable. And in the final chapter of our story, we need to look at what happened when that glittering world finally came crashing down, and what lessons we can learn from its fall. The mathematics of maintaining a Gilded Age lifestyle were quite simply insane, and eventually the numbers stopped working for almost everyone. Let me break down for you what it actually cost to live like these women did, because understanding the financial hemorrhaging helps explain why so many of these families eventually faced ruin, even with fortunes that seemed limitless. We have talked about some individual expenses, the gowns and the jewels and the ties, but let us add it all up and really see what we're dealing with. Start with residences. A proper Gilded Age family needed at least 3 homes. First, the city mansion. In New York, a Fifth Avenue mansion might cost $3 to $5 million to build, which is roughly $90 to $160 million today. But that is just the construction. Furnishing it with imported tapestries, old master paintings, rare furniture, and elaborate decorations could cost another several million. Total investment perhaps $200 million in today's money. Then the Newport cottage. These were not cottages in any normal sense of the word. They were palaces. Marble House cost $11 million in 1892, which is over $350 million today. The breakers built by another branch of the Vanderbilt family cost even more. And again, that is just construction. The furnishings, the artwork, the elaborate decorations all cost additional millions. And many families had a third home, perhaps a country estate in the Hudson Valley or a property in Europe. Add another several million for that. So before you've even moved in, before you've hired a single servant or bought a single gown, you've already spent the equivalent of perhaps $600 million to $1 billion in today's money just on real estate. Now let us talk about maintaining these properties. Each mansion required a full staff, A typical Fifth Avenue mansion might employ 30 to 50 servants. A Newport cottage might employ another 50 to 100 during the summer season. The total annual payroll for household staff could easily exceed $10 million in today's money, and that is just salaries. You also had to house them, feed them, clothe them in appropriate uniforms, and provide them with various benefits. Then there were the operating costs. Heating a mansion in winter required burning coal or wood in dozens of fireplaces. The cost was staggering. Keeping the grounds maintained required MS of gardeners. The stables, if you kept horses and carriages, required grooms and stable hands. The annual operating cost for a major property could easily exceed 5 to 10 million in today's money, and you had not just one property, you had 3, and most of them were occupied for only part of the year, but they still required year-round maintenance and staffing. Now add the personal expenses, the clothing. A society woman needed a completely new wardrobe every season, not just a few new dresses, dozens of new dresses, morning dresses, afternoon dresses, tea, gowns, evening gowns, ball gowns, plus the accessories, the shoes, the gloves, the hats, the parasols, and everything had to come from the best designers, primarily from Paris. The cost of shopping trips alone, with travel to Europe, hotel stays, and the actual purchases, could exceed $1 million per trip in today's money, and you might make multiple trips per year. The jewels were another massive expense. A major piece of jewelry, a tiara or a diamond necklace, could cost the equivalent of 5 to 10 million today, and you could not just have one piece. You needed a collection, different jewels for different occasions. The insurance costs alone for a major jewelry collection could exceed $100,000 per year in today's money. Then there was entertainment. A major ball might cost the equivalent of 5 to 10 million today. The flowers alone could cost hundreds of thousands. The food and wine, particularly if you were serving imported delicacies and vintage champagne to hundreds of guests, could cost another several $100,000. The orchestra, the decorations, the special lighting, all of it added up, and you could not just throw one party per season. If you wanted to maintain your position, you needed to entertain regularly. There were also the costs of travel. Gilded Age families traveled constantly to Europe for the season, to Newport for the summer, to Florida or California for the winter. Each journey required booking entire railroad cars or steamship cabins. The cost of first-class travel for a family and their essential staff could easily exceed several hundred $0,000 per trip in today's money. And let us not forget about the extras, the yachts which many wealthy families owned, the racing horses, the art collections which required not just purchase but also insurance, conservation, and security, the charitable donations which were expected and which served as a form of social advertising. All of these added up to additional millions per year. When you add it all up, the annual cost of maintaining a top-tier Gilded Age lifestyle could easily exceed 20 to 30 million in today's money every single year, just to maintain the status quo, not to get ahead, not to outdo your rivals, just to keep up with where you were. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but these families had enormous fortunes. The Vanderbilts were worth hundreds of millions. Surely they could afford this, and you would be right for a generation or maybe 2. But here is the problem. Wealth does not stay constant. It either grows or it shrinks. And for many of these families, it was shrinking. Think about the Vanderbilt fortune. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, left about $100 million when he died in 1877, an enormous sum, the equivalent of over $3 billion today. But he split it among multiple heirs, with the largest share going to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt. William Henry doubled the fortune, getting it up to about $200 million by his death in 1885, but then he split it among his children. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Alva's husband, received about $65 million, roughly $1.8 billion in today's money. Sounds like plenty, right? Except Willie was spending money at an incredible rate. The mansions, the yachts, the ties, Consul's dowry to the Duke of Marlborough, Alva's divorce settlement. By the time Willie died in 1920, his fortune had shrunk significantly, and it was divided again among his heirs. By the third and fourth generations, many Vanderbilt descendants found themselves, if not poor, then certainly not wealthy enough to maintain the lifestyle they had been raised to expect. The fortune had been subdivided too many times and the spending had been too extravagant. This pattern repeated itself across many Gilded Age families. Enormous fortunes built by ruthless industrialists were dissipated within 2 or 3 generations by descendants who were excellent at spending money but not at making it. And here is where women's lack of financial control becomes particularly relevant. In most of these families, the wealth was tied up in trusts controlled by men. Women received income from these trusts, but they had little say in how the principal was managed or invested. If the men in the family made bad investments, if they failed to adapt to changing economic conditions, if they simply spent too much, the women suffered the consequences without having had any ability to prevent the disasters. There is a famous saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The idea is that the first generation builds the wealth through hard work and sacrifice. The second generation maintains it and enjoys it. The third generation, raised in luxury without understanding what it took to create that luxury, squanders it. By the fourth generation, the family is back to poverty or at least to middle-class status. This pattern was playing out across Gilded Age families by the early 1900s, and women who had been taught from birth that their role was to spend money beautifully rather than to make or manage it were particularly vulnerable. Consider the case of a hypothetical but typical Gilded Age woman. Let us call her Ella. Her grandfather made a fortune in railroads. Her father inherited that fortune and maintained it, though he also spent lavishly. She was raised in enormous luxury, multiple mansions, Paris gowns, jewels. She was taught that this was normal, that this was how people like her lived. She married well to another wealthy man. They had the expected multiple residences. They entertained lavishly. They traveled constantly. They maintained the lifestyle they had both been raised to expect. But then several things happened. Her husband made some bad investments. The financial panic of 1907 wiped out a significant portion of their wealth. Death taxes, when her father died, took another chunk. The expenses of maintaining their properties and lifestyle never decreased, but their income did. By the time Ella was in her 52nd, she might discover that the family fortune that had seemed inexhaustible was actually nearly gone. They might have to sell properties, let go of staff, scale back dramatically, and Ella, who had never been taught anything practical about money management, who had never worked a day in her life, who had no skills that could earn an income, would be terrified. This was not a hypothetical situation. This happened to real women across America in the early 20th century. Some adapted, some found ways to make money from their social positions, perhaps by writing memoirs or endorsing products. Some married again, this time explicitly for financial security. And some simply struggled, maintaining a facade of wealth, while the reality behind the facade grew increasingly desperate. The most poignant examples are the stories of women who had to sell their jewels piece by piece to maintain their lifestyles. A tiara sold discreetly through a private jeweler to pay the property taxes, a necklace auctioned to cover household expenses. Each sale a little admission of defeat, a little acknowledgement that the glittering life was unsustainable. And remember, Teresa, fair Ulrichs, one of the triumvirate. When husband Herman died suddenly, she discovered that his business affairs were not as solid as they appeared. Yes, she had her own inherited wealth from her father's mining fortune, but Herman's estate was smaller than expected, and she had to fight legally just to get half of it. Even at the very top of society, even with multiple fortunes to draw on, financial security was not guaranteed. This speaks to a larger truth about the Gilded Age and really about any era of extreme wealth inequality. The appearance of wealth and the reality of wealth are often very different. Many of the people who looked richest were actually deeply in debt. Many of the mansions were mortgaged. Many of the jewels were paste copies of the originals which had been quietly sold years earlier. The system required constant massive inflows of cash just to maintain itself. And when those inflows slowed, when businesses failed or investments went bad or inheritance taxes ate away at principal, the whole elaborate structure could come crashing down surprisingly quickly. There is also a psychological cost to all this that we should not overlook. Imagine the stress of knowing that your entire social position, your entire way of life depends on maintaining an impossibly expensive facade. That if you stop spending at this incredible rate, if you economize even slightly, people will know you are in financial trouble and you will be shunned. That is an enormous amount of pressure. Some women coped by simply not thinking about money at all. They spent as they had always spent and let their husbands or business managers worry about where the money came from. This ignorance might have been blissful in the short term, but it left them completely unprepared for financial disaster when it came. Other women became obsessed with money, constantly, worried about whether they had enough, whether the fortune would last, whether disaster lurked around the corner. This anxiety was particularly acute for women who had experienced financial insecurity in their youth, like Alva Vanderbilt. Having once been poor or nearly poor, they can never quite shake the fear that it could happen again. And here is another factor we have not fully explored: the emotional cost of living for appearances when your entire life is performance, when you can never relax, never be yourself, never admit weakness or fear or unhappiness. That takes a tremendous psychological toll. Many Gilded Age women suffered from what we would today recognize as anxiety and depression. Back then they called it nervous exhaustion or female hysteria. And the treatment was often rest cures that were themselves traumatic. The pressure to be perfect, to maintain the facade, to never slip was relentless. And for women who had no real power, no legal rights, no control over their own lives, that pressure was suffocating. By the 1910s and 1920s, the Gilded Age was definitively over. World War I had changed everything. The Russian Revolution had frightened wealthy people everywhere with the specter of class revolution. Progressive taxation and new regulations were making it harder to accumulate and keep enormous fortunes. Social attitudes were shifting, with conspicuous consumption beginning to be seen as vulgar rather than admirable. The great mansions of Fifth Avenue were torn down one by one, replaced by apartment buildings and office towers. The Newport cottages were closed up too, expensive to maintain, eventually becoming museums or falling into ruin. The elaborate social hierarchies that had seemed so permanent, so important, began to crumble, and the women who had lived through that era, some like Consuelo and Alva, found new purposes and new freedoms. Others clung desperately to the old ways, maintaining small versions of their former lifestyles, stubbornly wearing their old jewels and hosting tiny dinner parties for a social scene that no longer existed. But here is what is important. The lessons from their experiences, the mistakes they made, and the cost they paid remain relevant. Because while we may not live in the Gilded Age anymore, we still live in a world where appearances matter, where conspicuous consumption is a thing, where people go into debt to maintain lifestyles they cannot afford, where women still sometimes lack financial literacy and control. The specific details have changed, but the underlying dynamics remain surprisingly similar. And that is what we need to talk about as we move toward the conclusion of our story. Sometimes the most powerful moments in history come not from grand gestures, but from quiet acts of courage. And for both Consuelo and Alva, their final chapters were defined by choices that took tremendous bravery, even if that bravery looked different for each of them. Consuelo's liberation, as we discussed, came in stages. The separation in 1906, the divorce in 1921, the annulment in 1926. Each step was a breaking of chains, a shedding of expectations, a claiming of autonomy that Gilded Age society said was impossible. But what happened after the annulment, after she married Jacques Balsa, is equally important. because Consuelo did not just find personal happiness, she found purpose throughout her years at Blenheim, even during the unhappiest times. Consuelo had devoted herself to charitable work. This was expected of aristocratic women, of course. But for Consuelo, it became more than duty. It became a calling. She worked extensively with organizations focused on children's welfare. She visited hospitals and orphanages. She used her position and her connections to raise money and awareness for causes she cared about. And after she left England and settled in France with Jack, she continued this work, perhaps even more, intensely, because now she was doing it for herself, not for appearances. During World War I, Consuelo had organized relief efforts for French soldiers and refugees. She established hospitals. She coordinated supply distributions. She used her wealth and her social connections to make a real difference during a time of tremendous suffering. After the war, she focused on housing, reform, and child welfare. She believed that every child deserved a safe home and access to education and health care. These were not radical beliefs by our standards today, but in the early 20th century, particularly coming from someone of her background, they represented a genuine commitment to social change. In 1957, the French government awarded Consuelo the Legion of Honor, France's highest decoration in recognition of her humanitarian work. Think about that for a moment. The woman who had been forced into marriage, who had been treated as a commodity, who had spent years trapped in a gilded cage, ended her life being honored by a nation for her service to others. And what about her relationship with her sons, those two boys she had given birth to fulfill her duty as Duchess? John, the elder, who became the 10th Duke of Marlborough, and Iva, the younger. Despite the unhappiness of her marriage, Consuelo maintained close relationships with both of them. She had not let her own suffering poison her children. She'd not used them as weapons against their father. She'd simply loved them, supported them, and maintained connection with them throughout her life. This speaks to a kind of emotional maturity and grace that is honestly remarkable. It would have been easy, understandable, even for Consuelo to become bitter, to be angry at the world for what had been done to her, to lash out at everyone around her, but she did not. She found a way to transform her pain into compassion, her suffering into service, and yes, she also found happiness. Her marriage to Jacques Balzan, which lasted until his death in 1956, was by all accounts genuinely loving. They were partners. They respected each other. They enjoyed each other's company. At their shadow in France, they hosted friends and family. They gardened. They read. They talked. They lived the kind of quiet, contented life that Consuelo had never imagined would be possible for her. When Consuelo published her autobiography in 1953, The Glitter and the Gold, it was both a catharsis and a reclaiming of her own narrative. For decades, her story had been told by others. Newspapers had written about her wedding. Society columns had tracked her movements. Gossip had swirled around her separation and divorce. But finally, she got to tell her own story in her own words. The book was not bitter or vengeful. It was honest about her suffering, yes, but it was also measured and thoughtful. She acknowledged her mother's cruelty, but also tried to understand it. She described the Duke's coldness, but without demonizing him. She told the truth about what had been done to her, but she did so with a kind of dignity that must have required tremendous strength. And here is something beautiful. In the last years of her life, Consuelo and her mother, Alva, had reconciled. Not perfectly, not without complications, but they had found their way back to each other. Alva, remember, had undergone her own transformation from social climber to suffragist warrior, from a woman obsessed with status to a woman fighting for women's rights. After Oliver Belmont's death in 1908, Alva had thrown herself completely into the suffrage movement. In January 1917, Alva organized something unprecedented. The first picketing of the White House in American history Women, including Alva herself, stood outside the White House with signs demanding the right to vote. They were called the Silent Sentinels because they did not shout or chant. They just stood there day after day, silently bearing witness to the injustice of denying women the vote. This was dangerous work. The pickers were harassed, attacked, arrested. Some were sent to prison where they were force-fed when they went on hunger strikes. Alva, wealthy and in her 60 seconds, put herself on the line alongside much younger women. She used her money to bail protesters out of jail. She paid legal fees. She provided financial support to women who lost their jobs for participating in protests. In 1919, when the 19th Amendment was finally passed by Congress and sent to the states for ratification, Alva was one of the leaders celebrating that victory. And when it was ratified in August 1920, giving women the right to vote, Alva had been instrumental in making it happen. She served as president of the National Women's Party from 1921 until her death. She purchased the organization's headquarters in Washington, a beautiful building that is now the Belmont Pole, Women's Equality National Monument. She continued to fight for the Equal Rights Amendment for women's economic independence, for complete equality under the law. Think about the arc of Alva's life. She started as a girl who lost everything at 17 and learned that the world was harsh and unforgiving. She became a woman who fought ruthlessly for social position, who manipulated and controlled, who forced her daughter into a loveless marriage. And she ended as a woman fighting for other women's freedom, using her wealth and influence to challenge the very system that had given her power. Was this redemption? Partial redemption? Or just another form of control where Alva got to decide what women's liberation should look like? I honestly do not know. Alva remained complicated and contradictory to the end. But here is what I find moving about her later years. She tried. She acknowledged, at least implicitly, that the way she had lived, the values she had held, had been wrong in important ways. She used her considerable energy and resources to try to make things better for women who came after her, and she testified in that annulment proceeding, publicly admitting that she had forced Consuelo into marriage, which must have taken courage even for someone as tough as Alva. When Alva bought a chateau near Consuelo's in France in her later years, it was a kind of apology, perhaps, or at least a desire for reconciliation, and Consuelo accepted it. Mother and daughter, who had caused each other so much pain, found a way to be in each other's lives again. Alva died in January 1933 at the age of 80. Her funeral, with its all-female bearers, was a final statement about women's strength and equality. Consuelo was there, mourning the complicated woman who had been her mother, and Consuelo lived another 31 years after that, dying in December 1964 at the age of 87. She outlived not just her mother, but almost everyone from that Gilded Age world. The ballrooms where she had danced were long closed. The social hierarchies that had seemed so permanent had dissolved. The rules that had governed every aspect of her early life were forgotten. But Consuelo had survived, more than survived. She had built a life of meaning, of service, of genuine happiness. She had broken free from the gilded cage and discovered that freedom, while sometimes scary, was worth any cost. Now, you might be wondering, what about the other women we have discussed? What happened to them? My fish, the eccentric party thrower D.I., died in 1915. Her death was relatively sudden, and some speculated that the constant pressure of entertaining, of maintaining her position, of being perpetually on, had simply worn her out. She was 61, not particularly old, but she had lived a life of such intensity that perhaps it aged her prematurely. Tessie Ricks continued to reign over Newport society until her own death. After winning her legal battle over her husband's estate, she remained wealthy and influential. She sold Rosecliff, eventually unable or unwilling to maintain such an expensive property. The mansion is now a museum open to the public. People can walk through those rooms where Tessie once hosted elaborate parties and maybe feel a ghost of that vanished world. And what about Blenheim Palace? Consul's sons, John and Ivor, both lived full lives. John X Duke inherited Blenheim and struggled as dukes had for generations to maintain the enormous estate. Eventually, Blenheim was opened to the public as a tourist attraction. The Vanderbilt money that had saved it in the 1890s helped preserve it through the mid-century. Today, it is one of Britain's most visited historic houses, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists from around the world come to see the palace where Consuelo once cried herself to sleep. The irony is that Blenheim is now famous partly because of its connection to Consuelo, the American dollar princess who never wanted to be there in the first place. Her story, her suffering, has become part of the palace's legend. There is even a cradle on display, an elaborate Italian cradle that Alva commissioned for Consuelo's first son, modeled after Napoleon's son's cradle. It sits in one of the staterooms, a symbol of Alva's ambitions and Consuelo's duty. The great Fifth Avenue mansions where Mrs. Disaster held court, where Alva threw her legendary parties, are almost all gone now, torn down in the 1920s and 30s to make way for apartment buildings and office towers. The Empire State Building stands where Mrs. Ayres's mansion once stood. The site of the Vanderbilt mansions is now occupied by high-rise buildings. The physical structures of the Gilded Age have largely disappeared from New York. Newport is different. Many of the cottages still stand, preserved as museums. You can visit Marble House, Alva's palace. You can walk through the Breakers, the largest of them all. You can see Rosecliff, where Tessie entertained. These houses are frozen in time, carefully maintained look as they did during their glory days. But here is what strikes me about visiting these places. They feel empty, not just because they are no longer lived in, but because the life that once filled them, the ambition and the competition, and the desperate striving for status, all of that is gone. They are beautiful buildings, but they are also monuments to a particular kind of excess and unhappiness, because that is ultimately what the Gilded Age was. Is it not beautiful on the surface, impressive or inspiring even? But underneath there was so much suffering, so much waste, so much human potential squandered in the pursuit of status and the maintenance of appearances. The women we've been talking about, they were both victims and perpetrators of this system. They suffered under its rules, but some of them, like Alva, also enforced those rules ruthlessly on others. They were trapped, but they also benefited from their privileged positions in ways that millions of other women could not. And yet, despite everything, despite the cruelty and the waste and the suffering, some of them found ways to grow, to change, to use their experiences, however painful, to become better versions of themselves. Alva transformed from social climber to suffragist. Consuelo transformed from trap daughter to compassionate philanthropist. Both women in their own ways found liberation. Not complete liberation, not perfect happiness, but something real, something earned through pain and struggle and the courage to keep trying. And I think that is ultimately the most important lesson from their stories. That change is possible. That we are not forever defined by the worst things that happen to us or the worst things we do. That even when we are trapped in systems that seem immovable, there are still choices we can make, small acts of rebellion that can eventually lead to freedom. And that the courage to tell the truth, to acknowledge mistakes, to seek reconciliation, that courage matters. It may not fix everything, it may not erase the past, but it creates the possibility for a different future. And sometimes, possibility is enough. So, here we are, over 2 hours into this journey through the Gilded Age, and I want to bring us back to where we started. Those glittering ballrooms, those women in their Worth gowns and diamond tiaras, that world that looked so golden, so permanent, so enviable. And I want to ask you, what can we learn from their stories? Because if we are just telling these tales for entertainment, if we are just gawking at the drama and the wealth and the scandals, then we have missed the point. These were real women. They lived real lives. They made real choices, both terrible and courageous, and their experiences have lessons for us today, over a century later. Let me start with the most obvious lesson. Financial independence matters desperately, urgently, fundamentally. Every woman in our story who lacked financial control suffered for it. Consul was forced into marriage partly because she had no independent means to support herself. If she had run away, with Winthrop Rutherford, how would she have lived? She had been raised to be an ornament, not to support herself. Her vulnerability came not just from her mother's cruelty, but from a system that ensured women could not survive without male financial support. Even the wealthy women we discussed, women with access to millions, were vulnerable because they did not control that wealth directly. It was in trusts managed by men. It could be lost through bad investments or business failures that they had no say in preventing. When husbands died, women often discovered they had far less security than they had assumed. This is still relevant today, is it not? How many women do you know who leave all the financial decisions to their partners, who do not understand their family's investments or debts, who would be lost if suddenly they had to manage money on their own? The specifics have changed. We have more legal rights now, but the fundamental vulnerability that comes from financial ignorance or dependence has not disappeared. So here is lesson 1. Understand money. Learn about investing, about budgeting, about financial planning. Have accounts in your own name. Know where your money is and where it goes. Do not let anyone, no matter how much you trust them, have complete control over your financial security, because situations change. People die, people leave, businesses fail, and if you do not understand your own finances, you are vulnerable in ways you may not realize until it is too late. The second lesson is about the danger of living for appearances, of making choices based on what other people will think rather than what is right for you. Alva forced Consuelo into marriage because she cared more about social position than about her daughter's happiness. Mrs. Astor and her set created elaborate rules about who mattered and who did not, based on criteria that were ultimately arbitrary and meaningless. Countless women stayed in unhappy marriages, maintained impossibly expensive lifestyle they could not afford, and sacrificed their own well-being because they were terrified of what people would say. And we still do this, do we not? Maybe not in the same ways. We are not trying to get into Mrs. A's ballroom anymore, but we are trying to get likes on social media. We are keeping up with what our neighbors or colleagues have. We are presenting a carefully curated version of our lives to the world while struggling privately with debt, unhappiness, anxiety. The technical term for this is lifestyle inflation, but really it is the same trap that caught Gilded Age families. The belief that if you just spend a little more, acquire a little more, present a slightly better image to the world, then you will be happy, you will be respected, you will be enough. But it is a lie. It was a lie in 1895, and it is a lie today. So, lesson 2, live authentically. Make choices based on what genuinely serves your well-being and happiness, not on what looks good to others. Because the people judging you, they're probably just as insecure and trapped as you are, and the approval you are seeking from them is not actually worth the price you are paying for it. The third lesson is about the possibility of change, both personal change and systemic change. Alva changed, not completely, not perfectly, but she went from being a woman who cared only about social climbing to being a woman who fought for women's suffrage. She went from enforcing oppressive rules to challenging them. Yes, she remained contradictory. Yes, she did terrible things even after her transformation, but she demonstrated that people can grow, can question their beliefs, can dedicate themselves to causes larger than themselves. Consul changed too. She went from being a passive victim to being an active agent in her own life. It took decades. It required tremendous courage. But she eventually found the strength to leave an unhappy marriage, to reclaim her autonomy, to build a life of meaning and service, and society changed. The suffrage movement that Alva fought for succeeded. Women got the vote in 1920. Divorce became more acceptable. Women gained legal rights to property and income. The rigid social hierarchies of the Gilded Age dissolved. The change was slow and incomplete, but it happened. This matters because it is easy to feel trapped, to believe that the way things are is the way things must always be, that oppressive systems are too powerful to challenge, that personal circumstances cannot be changed. But history shows us that this is not true. Systems change, people change, and that change often begins with individuals who find the courage to say no more and to make different choices even when those choices are difficult and costly. So lesson 3, do not accept that you are permanently stuck. Whether you are in a bad relationship, a stifling career, a destructive pattern of behavior, an oppressive system, know that change is possible. It may take time. It may require sacrifice, but it is possible. And sometimes the first step toward change is simply believing that change can happen. The 4th lesson is about the true cost of control, particularly parental control. Alva controlled every aspect of Consuel's life. She made all the decisions. She forced Consuelo into a marriage that destroyed years of her daughter's life, and she did this at least in part because she genuinely believed she was protecting Consuelo. She thought she was ensuring her daughter's security, but she was wrong. Her control did not protect Consuelo. It harmed her deeply, lastingly. The security Alva was trying to provide came at the cost of Consuelo's happiness, autonomy, and well-being. This is a lesson for parents, particularly parents who have experienced hardship or insecurity. The impulse. See, to protect your children, to ensure they never suffer as you suffered, is understandable and even beautiful. But when that impulse becomes control, when you start making all their choices for them, when you deny them the right to make mistakes and learn and grow, you're not protecting them, you're stunting them. Children, even adult children, need to make their own choices. They need to be allowed to fail, to learn, to become themselves. Your job as a parent is not to control their lives. It is to give them the tools they need to build their own lives. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to step back and let them choose, even when you think they are choosing wrong. So lesson 4, if you are a parent, love your children enough to let them be themselves. And if you are a child with controlling parents, know that their control comes from their own fear and trauma, not from your inadequacy. You have the right to your own life, your own choices, your own mistakes. The 5th lesson is about forgiveness and reconciliation. Not because forgiveness is always required or always appropriate, but because Consuelo and Alva's story shows us that even deeply damaged relationships can sometimes be partially healed. Consuelo had every reason to hate her mother. Alva had beaten her as a child, forced her into marriage, caused her decades of suffering, and yet they reconciled. Not perfectly. The relationship was never what it should have been, but they found a way to be in each other's lives, to have some kind of connection. Why? I think partly because Consuelo understood that holding on to hatred was hurting her more than it was hurting Alva, partly because she saw that Alva, in her own imperfect way, was trying to change, and partly because life is short and complicated, and sometimes maintaining relationships, even damaged ones, matters. This does not mean you have to forgive everyone who hurts you. Some relationships are too toxic, too damaging, too dangerous to maintain. If someone is actively harming you, protecting yourself is more important than reconciliation. But if there is a possibility for healing, if the other person is genuinely trying to change, if maintaining some connection would bring more peace than pain, then forgiveness becomes an option worth considering. So lesson 5, forgiveness is not weakness, it is strength. And sometimes the person you are really forgiving is yourself, letting go of anger and resentment that is consuming you, choosing peace over justice, moving forward rather than staying trapped in past pain. Now, let me bring this to our present moment, because the Gilded Age may be over, but the dynamics we have been discussing are still very much with us. We still live in a world of enormous wealth inequality. The gap between the richest and everyone else is as large now as it was in the Gilded Age, perhaps larger. We still have people living in mansions while others struggle to afford basic necessities. We still have a system where your last name, your connections, your starting position in life dramatically affect your opportunities. We still have conspicuous consumption. Instagram influencers showing off luxury goods, reality television celebrating excessive wealth. A culture that often judges people's worth by what they own, rather than who they are. The ballrooms have been replaced by social media feeds, but the underlying dynamic is the same. Performing wealth to gain status and approval. We still have forced choices, particularly around marriage and career. Maybe not as overtly as Consuelo's situation, but how many people feel trapped by family expectations, by social pressure to marry or have children or pursue certain careers, by the weight of other people's dreams for them. And we still have financial vulnerability, particularly for women. Yes, we have more legal rights now, but the gender pay gap persists. Women still do more unpaid labor. Women are still more likely to be financially insecure, especially in old age. These specific mechanisms have changed, but the underlying inequality remains. So, the lessons from the Gilded Age are not just historical curiosities. They are urgently relevant to how we live now, to the choices we make about money, about relationships, about what we value, about how we define success and happiness. Here is what I hope you take away from these stories. Wealth does not guarantee happiness. Status does not guarantee security. Controlling others does not protect them. And living for appearances will leave you empty. What matters is authenticity, connection, purpose, the courage to make your own choices and live with the consequences, the wisdom to understand that what looks golden on the outside may be hollow on the inside, and the compassion to recognize that everyone, even people who seem to have everything, is fighting battles you cannot see. The ballrooms of the Gilded Age are closed now. The orchestras have stopped playing. The champagne has gone flat. The jewels have been sold or locked away in museums. The mansions have been torn down or turned into tourist attractions. That world is gone, and honestly good riddance to much of it. It was a world built on inequality, cruelty, and unsustainable excess. But the women who lived in that world, their stories remain. Their struggles, their courage, their mistakes, their transformations. These stories have value, not because we should want to live like they did, but because they show us in stark relief what happens when we prioritize the wrong things, when we value wealth over happiness, status over authenticity, control over love, appearances over reality. Consuelo Vanderbilt Spee, the first half of her life trapped in a gilded cage. She spent the second half free, building a life of meaning and service and genuine happiness. Which half do you think she treasured more? Which half do you think she was grateful for as she looked back from the end of her long life? The answer is obvious. And yet, how many of us are still building gilded cages for ourselves, still chasing wealth and status at the expense of happiness and authenticity, still letting other people's expectations control our choices, still performing for an audience that does not actually care about us? You have one life, one chance to figure out what matters to you and to build a life around that. One opportunity to be authentic, to take risks, to choose love and meaning over security and status. One shot at freedom. Do not waste it trying to get into someone else's ballroom. Do not squander it maintaining appearances that mean nothing. Do not sacrifice your happiness on the altar of other people's expectations. Learn from these women, both from their mistakes and from their eventual courage. Understand that money matters but cannot buy the things that matter most. Know that you have more power than you think to change your life even when you feel trapped. Believe that redemption is possible, that growth is possible, that finding your way from the glitter to the gold is possible. And maybe, just maybe, remember that the most valuable things in life, the things that will matter when you are 87 years old looking back, are not the parties you attended, or the status you achieved, or the wealth you accumulated. They are the connections you made, the love you gave and received, the courage you found to be yourself, the service you provided to others, the meaning you created in a world that too often values meaninglessness. Thank you so much for staying with me on this long journey through the Gilded Age. Thank you for listening to these stories of ballrooms and bankruptcies, of wealth and suffering, of oppression and liberation. I hope you found something valuable in these tales, something that spoke to you, something that made you think about your own life, your own choices, your own definitions of success and happiness. If you enjoyed this story, please let me know in the comments. Tell me which part resonated with you most. Tell me if you see parallels in our modern world. Tell me your own thoughts about wealth, status, control, freedom. I love hearing from you. And please, if you have not already, subscribe to this channel because we have so many more stories to tell. Stories of other eras, other people, other lessons from history that remain urgently relevant to how we live now. Next time we will explore another fascinating chapter of human experience, another set of characters whose lives can teach us something important about our own. Until then, sleep well. Dream of freedom, not cages, of authenticity, not appearances, of meaning, not status. And remember, you're not trapped. You have choices.